The chain gave a groan like a mountain clearing its throat, and Myra Voss was already 3 feet up the beast's foreleg when the first guard screamed. She did not remember deciding to climb. 1 second she had been flat on her stomach under the fence rail, chasing Pebble's flash of blue scales into the dust of the cradle pit, and the next the whole world had gone dark and warm and smelled like hot iron and old rain. She looked up, and up. A wall of black stone-plated hide rose over her, taller than the grain silos back home, each plate the size of a dinner tray and rimmed in a dull orange glow like coals under ash. Above that, impossibly high, a head turned toward her slow, unhurried, the way a mountain might turn if a mountain had decided, after 10,000 years, to finally look down. Ithger's eye found her. It was the size of a serving platter, slit-pupiled, burning amber-orange from somewhere behind the iris, like a window into a furnace 3 rooms away. Myra had seen a lot of eyes. Her mother kept vials of alien retinal tissue in the lab refrigerator and let her look at slides sometimes. She was not afraid of eyes. She reached up, grabbed a fistful of the smoldering amber quills running down the beast's shoulder, and pulled herself higher. Behind her, someone was shouting her name, several someones. And underneath the shouting, quieter, a sound she would not understand the weight of until much later, 40,000 Varn in the stone tiers of the cradle pit, going utterly, perfectly silent. Regent Steward Dreeth Corin stood on the high platform with his hand already half raised to signal the spear guard, and he did not lower it. He simply, slowly, stopped moving it forward. Because Ithger the cradle-bound, untamable, unchained by choice, the beast that had killed 4 trial candidates in 11 years and maimed a 5th so badly he had to be carried from the pit in a sling, had gone still. Not still with rage. The coiled stillness that came before it tore a challenger's spear in half and used the pieces on the challenger. Still the way water goes still. Still like it was listening. A 9-year-old human girl in a mud-streaked field jacket was sitting on its shoulder, one small hand flat against a quill the length of her own forearm, and the mountain that had never once in living memory allowed a hand to touch it without answering in blood had simply let her. Myra looked down at the sea of stone-gray and rust-red faces staring up at her from the tiers, felt Ithger's next breath move under her like a held tide, and said, in the clear, unbothered voice of a child who had genuinely, honestly, lost track of her lizard, "Has anybody seen a blue skink? About this big?" Answers to Pebble. Nobody answered. Nobody in that pit had a single word ready for what they were looking at. That was how it started. Not with a prophecy, not with a bloodline, not with anything the Varn had spent 600 years of law preparing for. It started with a girl who had crawled under a restricted fence to catch a pet lizard, and a beast that had apparently been waiting the entire time for someone to simply not be afraid of it. Aldergate Landing sat 2 kilometers down the ridge from the cradle pit, a scatter of prefab domes and solar collectors clinging to a shelf of gray rock the Varn called the Low Terraces, and the human colonists called, with the grim affection of people who'd built their lives there, the gravel. It was the newest human outpost on Keswick's Reach, 11 years old, 41 families, a mineral survey contract, and a treaty with the Emberhold clans so fragile that Administrator Holt kept the actual signed document in a fireproof box rather than trust it to a server. Myra's mother, Dr. Priya Voss, had been the outpost's xenobiologist and treaty liaison since before Myra was born. Her father, Callum Voss, ran water reclamation and, more usefully on any given day, ran after Myra. He had been running after her for 11 minutes when he reached the cradle pit's outer fence and saw, through the gap where a rail had come loose exactly the width of a determined 9-year-old, his daughter sitting on the shoulder of the largest living thing he had ever seen with his own eyes, 40,000 strangers staring at her in dead silence, and a man in ceremonial obsidian robes on the high platform with one arm frozen in the air like he'd forgotten what it was for. Callum did not scream her name a second time. He had learned, in 9 years of parenting a child who treated fences as suggestions, that screaming only made her flinch, and flinching on the shoulder of an untamable sacred monster seemed like exactly the wrong thing for anyone to do right now. Myra, his voice came out steadier than he felt. Sweetheart, nice and slow, just hold on to something and don't move fast, all right? I'm not moving fast, Myra called back, entirely reasonably. He's not moving at all. Dad, I think he's the biggest thing I've ever touched. He, not asterisk it. Callum filed that away with the part of his brain that was still functioning like a scientist's, husband instead of a father watching his daughter perch on a war god. On the platform, Dreeth Corin lowered his arm at last, though every line of his body still strained toward the signal he had almost given. Around him, the trial elders, 4 Varn in the deep red robes of the Emberhold's eldest bloodlines, stood locked in postures that ranged from horror to something that, on a human face, would have been unmistakably close to grief. Steward, the eldest of them, a stooped Varn named Kessa Oren whose robes bore 3 generations of trial scars sewn into the hem, did not look away from the beast. Do you see what I see? I see a child in a restricted zone, Dreeth said, too fast, too flat. I see a breach of colony treaty and a breach of pit security, and I see it being corrected. Guard Captain. Steward, wait, Kessa's hand closed on his sleeve. It has killed men in armor for touching the outer chain, Dreeth said, low, only for the elders. It will not tolerate a bare-handed child for longer than it takes to decide she's small enough to swallow whole. Get her down before it changes its mind. But even as he said it, he was watching Ithgar's head lower, slow as a drawbridge, until the great furnace-orange eye was level with the small human hand still resting against its shoulder quill. A rumble rolled out of its chest, not the tearing snarl the pit had heard 4 times in 11 years, but something lower, a sound with almost no edges to it at all, that Myra felt in her back teeth and mistook, correctly, for the sound a very large cat makes when it has decided you belong to it. That, said old Kessa Oren quietly, is not a beast deciding whether to kill something small. Steward, in 61 years I have stood at this rail through 9 trials. I know that sound. My grandmother taught me that sound before I could walk. That is Ithgar's welcome cry. He has not made that sound in this pit in 600 years. Dreeth said nothing. His jaw worked once, twice, and something moved behind his eyes that had nothing to do with sacred wonder and everything to do with arithmetic, fast, cold, and entirely his own. Because Dreeth Corin knew exactly what the welcome cry meant under Emberhold law, and exactly what it would cost him if the wrong ears heard it named aloud before he had time to decide what to do about it. The guard captain, a broad-shouldered Varn named Ussa Bren, plated in the scorched black armor of the pit wardens, did not wait for a second order. She had spent 9 years training for exactly one job, getting bodies out of the cradle pit before Ithgar decided to make more of them. She signaled 2 of her spear line forward, low and fast along the wall, angling toward the beast's foreleg where the small human shape still sat. Ithgar's head came up. It happened too fast for Myra to be frightened of it, which was, Callum would think much later, possibly the only reason she survived the next 4 seconds without a mark on her. One moment the beast's great head was tilted toward her, curious and slow. The next, a sound tore out of its chest that had every one of the 40,000 Varn in the tiers flinching back as one body, and its tail, long as a transport shuttle, plated in the same smoldering stone, swept flat and hard across the guard's path, close enough that Ussa Bren felt the wind of it lift the hair beneath her helmet. Not a killing blow, a wall, a door closing. The guard stopped dead. Ussa raised a fist, freezing her line, because she had also spent 9 years learning to read that particular difference. The difference between Ithgar deciding to end something and Ithgar deciding to simply not allow it, and every instinct honed across 200 trial seasons was screaming the same word at her. Don't. Captain, Dreeth called down, sharper now. Advance your line. Steward, with respect, if I advance that line, I will be carrying 3 of them out in bags and the girl will still be exactly where she is. Ussa did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the beast, on the low continuous rumble still rolling out of it, on the tail lying like a felled tree between her spears and the child. It isn't guarding its meal. It's guarding her. In the tears, the silence had started to break, not into panic, but into something Myra would spend a long time afterward trying to describe to people who hadn't been there. A murmur that moved through 40,000 throats at once, low and rising, the sound of an entire species watching a piece of law older than their empire rearrange itself in real time. Kessa Oran stepped to the platform rail, lifted both hands, palms out, the old gesture, the one that meant witness, all of you, witness this and remember it exactly, and spoke in a voice pitched to carry to the farthest tier without a single amplifier. Ithgar the Cradlebound has chosen. The word landed on the pit like a dropped stone. Dreeth's hand, still resting on the platform rail, went white-knuckled around the stone. Elder Oran, he said, careful, quiet, dangerous in the specific way of a man doing arithmetic in public and not liking the answer. The trial requires a bloodline candidate of the Emberhold clans to present themselves at the chain and be judged. That child is not Varn. She is not even old enough by our own law to present herself for judgment if she were Varn. There is no precedent. There is no precedent, Kessa agreed, because in 600 years nothing has ever climbed that chain that Ithgar did not immediately kill. We wrote the law around what the beast does. We did not write a law for what to do when the beast stops doing it. She turned, slow, and looked at Dreeth with the flat, unimpressed patience of a woman 4 times his age who had buried 2 wardens and outlasted 3 regents. I imagine we will need to write one now, steward. Since you hold the seat until a warden is confirmed, that duty falls to you. Something crossed Dreeth's face too fast for most of the watching tears to catch. Callum caught it, though, from the fence line, because he had spent 11 years reading the faces of men who did not want him to know what they were thinking, back when he'd worked contract negotiations on 3 different colony worlds before Aldergate. It wasn't fear. It wasn't wonder. It was the look of a man watching his own careful architecture develop a crack he had no idea yet how to patch. Down below, Myra, blessedly unaware that she had just become the single largest legal crisis in 600 years of Emberhold succession law, had found something more interesting to think about than politics. "You're not gonna eat my dad, right?" she asked Ithgar conversationally, patting the quill under her hand the way she'd pat a nervous horse. "He's right there by the fence. He worries a lot. It's kind of his whole thing." The rumble in Ithgar's chest shifted, registered, dropped, softened, rolled out long and low, and the great head turned, unhurried, toward the fence line where Callum Voss stood with both hands white-knuckled on the rail, and his heart trying to climb out through his throat. The furnace eye considered him for a long 3 seconds. Then Ithgar made a sound that no living Varn in that pit, not Kessa Oran in 61 years, not the oldest scar keeper in the deepest archive, had a name for. A short, huffing exhale through both nostril slits, almost amused, almost gentle, and it lowered its great head another foot until its shoulder, and the small human still sitting on it, came within 6 feet of the fence. "I think," Kessa Oran said slowly, into the ringing silence that followed, "that was a courtesy." Ussa Bren finally, carefully, lowered her spear line the rest of the way and let out a breath she had apparently been holding since the fence rail first gave way. "Steward," she said, "orders." Dreeth Corin looked down at the pit, at the beast that had shattered 600 years of settled law in under 2 minutes, at the small human girl sitting calm as Sunday on its shoulder, at the crowd already murmuring the word chosen in 40,000 variations of awe, and made the first of what would turn out to be many bad decisions. "Let the girl down," he said, "gently, and bring her to me." "I would like," he added, in a voice that carried just enough warmth to sound reasonable to anyone who hadn't watched his hand go white on the rail a minute earlier. "To speak with our young guest." Ithgar did not object when Myra slid, with the guard's careful help, back down its foreleg to solid ground. It watched her go the way a mountain watches weather move across it, patient, certain the weather would come back. But as she crossed the last stretch of open pit floor toward the platform stairs, walking backward half the way to keep looking at it, the beast's furnace eyes tracked her every step, and the low rumble in its chest never fully stopped. Neither, from that day forward, did Dreeth Corin's arithmetic. They put her in a side chamber cut into the rock behind the platform, all smoothed basalt and hanging braziers, with a low table and cushions arranged in the careful, overcorrect way of a room nobody had expected to use for a 9-year-old human. Her parents were let in a minute behind her, Priya Voss moving fast enough that she'd left her field satchel on the pit rail, Callum a half-step behind with the particular stillness of a man holding himself together by main force. Myra Voss. Dreeth Corin folded himself onto the cushion across the table with the unhurried grace of a man who had practiced looking unhurried for exactly moments like this one. Up close, without 40,000 tiers of witnesses, he looked younger than the ceremonial robes suggested, mid-30s in Varn years, sharp-featured, a thin scar along one jaw that Myra would later learn came from his own failed trial attempt at 19, the year before the old warden died and left the seat empty. "That's your name?" "Yes." Myra sat cross-legged on the cushion without being told, already looking around the chamber with the frank cataloging interest she brought to every new room, alien or otherwise. "Is this where you keep the beast when he's not in the pit?" "He is not kept anywhere, child. Ithgar has walked these mountains since before my grandmother's grandmother's grandmother drew breath. The chain in the pit is ceremonial. It has not held him in 600 years. He simply chooses to remain within it, except when he chooses not to." Dreeth's eyes flicked, briefly, to Priya. "Dr. Voss, I understand you serve as your outpost's liaison. I would ask that you explain to your daughter the severity of what has just happened, since I suspect she does not yet grasp it." "I grasp it fine," Myra said, before her mother could open her mouth. "I climbed a fence I wasn't supposed to climb and I'm in trouble. I know how trouble works." Something that might, on a more relaxed face, have been the beginning of a smile touched the corner of Dreeth's mouth and was gone before it could finish arriving. "That is not, in fact, the trouble you're in," he said. "The trouble you're in is considerably larger, and it is not, strictly speaking, your fault, which makes it worse, not better." He laced his fingers together on the table. "Under Emberhold law, the trial exists for a single purpose, to determine who is fit to hold the warden's seat, by proving they can approach Ithgar the Cradlebound and be recognized by him without dying in the attempt. Every candidate is drawn from the bloodline clans. Every candidate is a Varn, sworn, trained from birth for the honor and the risk of it. 4 have died in the trial in my lifetime alone. I bear the scar of my own failed attempt." He touched his jaw briefly, unconsciously. "The seat has stood empty 11 years because no candidate since has been *recognized. I have held the regency in the interim, as law requires, until a warden is confirmed." "And you climbed the fence to catch your lizard," Priya said quietly, from behind Myra's shoulder, "and the beast recognized you instead." "That," Dreeth said, "is the trouble." Callum finally found his voice, low and rough. "She's 9 years old. She's not Varn. Whatever your law says a warden needs to be, it can't possibly mean her." "No," Dreeth agreed, too smoothly, too fast. "It cannot. And that is, in fact, my professional opinion, which I will be advising the trial elders to adopt in full. The law was written for Varn candidates. A human child cannot inherit the warden's seat of the Emberhold clans, treaty or no treaty. The elders would never permit it. The clan lords would go to open war over it inside a season. And I suspect even your own colony government would object rather strenuously to a 9-year-old girl becoming the sovereign ruler of a mountain empire. He said it lightly, almost warmly, the reasonable man laying out the reasonable path, and Myra watched her father's shoulders drop half an inch in relief before Dreeth added, softer. The seat, however, is not the only question the beast's recognition raises. And that question, I am afraid, is not so easily set aside. Outside, muffled through a foot of basalt, they could all hear it, the low, continuous rumble of something enormous that had not stopped since a 9-year-old girl walked away from it across an open pit floor. It was Kessa Oran, entering without knocking with the unbothered authority of the oldest person in any room she'd ever stood in, who finally said the thing Dreeth had been circling for 10 minutes without landing on. "He's calling for her," the old elder said. "He has not stopped since she left the pit. Steward, you know as well as I do what that means for the girl, whatever it does or doesn't mean for your seat. Ithgar has not accepted a bonded companion in 6 centuries of record. The last one recorded was a warden's shield daughter, 300 years before my birth, and the histories say the beast mourned her for a full turning of the seasons when she died of old age and old woman, and he a creature untouched by time. Whatever this child is to him now, it is not a title. It is not a seat. It is a asterisk bond asterisk, steward, older and simpler than any law we've written, and I do not believe either of us has the authority to unmake it by declaring it inconvenient." Dreeth was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had gone very careful. "Are you suggesting, Elder, that we simply allow a human child free access to the cradle pit?" "Indefinitely." "I am suggesting," Kessa said, "that you go out there and listen to that sound for 1 more minute and then tell me you believe you have a choice." They went out. All of them, Dreeth stiff and silent, Kessa moving with the unhurried certainty of a woman who had already decided how this would end, Callum with one hand not quite on his daughter's shoulder and not quite not. Priya already reaching for the field recorder she kept clipped to her belt out of 19 years of scientific habit even now, even here. The rumble stopped the instant Myra stepped back out into the pit's gray afternoon light. Ithgar's great head came around, fast for something that size, and the furnace eyes fixed on her with an intensity that made 2 of the nearer guards take an involuntary step back. And then 60 feet of stone-plated apex predator lowered itself, slow and deliberate, until its head rested flat against the pit floor. The great curved tusks, longer than Myra, was tall, scraping twin lines through the dust, in a gesture so unmistakably a bow that even Dreeth Corin, watching from the platform with his jaw tight enough to ache, could not pretend it meant anything else. Something small moved in the shadow of Ithgar's foreleg, then another. Then 3 more, tumbling out from the den hollow at the pit's rear wall where the beast had denned for longer than any Varn alive could remember. Creatures the size of large dogs, plated in the same dark stone hide as their sire but softer at the edges, still growing into it, each one crowned with a stub of smoldering amber quill along its spine that had not yet learned to smoke properly. They came at a scrambling run, tripping over their own oversized paws, and piled up at the edge of the bowed head in a chittering, curious knot, sniffing the air toward the small human girl the way a litter of pups investigates anything new that has wandered into their den. "Oh," Myra said, in the voice of a child whose entire day had just improved dramatically. "You have asterisk babies." "Kindled," Kessa Oran murmured, half to herself, half to the stunned quiet of the pit. "5 of them, this brood. We did not know there were 5. He has never let anyone close enough to count." She looked at Myra, and for the first time since the fence rail gave way, something like wonder broke all the way through the old elder's composure. "Child, I do not think you understand yet what you have just been given." Myra was already crouched at the edge of the bowed, tusked head, one hand out, palm up, the way she offered her hand to every strange animal she'd ever met on a world that had taught her, over and over, that most things that looked terrifying just wanted to know you weren't a threat before they decided whether to be your friend. The nearest kindled, smaller than its litter mates, with one quill along its spine bent at an odd angle where it had grown wrong, bumped its blunt snout into her palm, and made a sound like a kettle just starting to think about boiling. "I think I understand plenty," Myra said, scratching behind the little creature's jaw the way you would a dog, and it promptly flopped sideways into the dust and presented its belly with the shameless enthusiasm of every young predator that has ever decided a particular human belongs to it now. "I think his name's gonna be Ash." Behind her, Dreeth Corin watched a 9-year-old human child name the first kindled broodling of Ithgar the Cradlebound in 600 years, and understood, with the cold clarity of a man who has just watched his careful decade of quiet control begin to come apart in public, that whatever happened next, it was no longer a problem he could simply wait out. It took the elders another hour of careful, circling argument to arrive at terms, most of which Myra spent sitting in the dust of the pit, with 4 kindled broodlings arranged around her like a spiny, warm, faintly smoking pile of laundry, while the 5th, a slightly larger pup with dark gray plating, and a habit of headbutting anything that held still too long, investigated her bootlaces with intense scientific focus. Ithgar had not moved from his bowed position the entire time, head flat on the stone, eyes half-lidded, radiating a contentment so enormous that even the guards along the wall had begun, cautiously, to relax their grips on their spears. The terms, when Kessa Oran finally read them aloud from the platform, were these. The human child Myra Voss would be permitted supervised access to the cradle pit on a fixed schedule, 3 days in 7, for as long as the bond persisted, under the observation of the trial elders and no fewer than 2 pit wardens at all times. She would claim no title, no seat, no standing under Emberhold succession law. The warden's seat would remain formally vacant and under Regent Dreeth Corin's stewardship, as it had for 11 years, pending. Kessa added this last clause with the flat, unhurried tone of a woman who knew exactly how much weight it carried and enjoyed watching Dreeth absorb it, pending further clarification of what Ithgar's recognition of a bonded companion means for the succession, a question the trial elders will now begin studying in earnest, for the first time in 600 years. Dreeth's expression did not change while Kessa read that clause aloud. Myra, glancing up from the gray, kindled pup gnawing thoughtfully on her bootlace, was the only one close enough to see his hand tighten, once on the platform rail, before he made himself let go. "There is one more matter," Kessa added, and beckoned toward the pit's rear wall, where an old Varn had been standing so quietly among the rock shadows that Myra hadn't noticed him until he moved. He was ancient even by Varn standards, his robes plain undyed wool rather than ceremonial red, a long braided beard gone the gray-white of old ash, and a walking staff carved, Myra would later learn, from the shed quill of a kindled that had died of old age 40 years before she was born. "This is Bram Asa, keeper of the cradle in service to 3 wardens before this seat stood empty. He has tended Ithgar and every brood of kindled born to him for longer than most of you have been alive. He will oversee the child's visits personally and instruct her, and her parents, in what she must and must not do within these walls, so that no one need guess at the rules of a bond none of us have ever witnessed before." Bram Asa crossed the pit floor with the unhurried gait of a man who had never once in 90 years felt the need to rush past a beast 4 stories tall, crouched with a soft grunt beside Myra and her pile of kindled, and looked at her for a long moment with pale, clouded eyes that missed considerably less than their cloudiness suggested. "You are not afraid of him," he said. "It wasn't a question." "Should I be?" "Everyone is," Bram said. "Everyone but you, apparently, and I have tended this beast and 4 broods of his kindled since before your grandmother's grandmother was born, and I have never once managed it myself." He reached out, slow, and let the gray-plated kindled sniff his knuckles before scratching under its jaw with the ease of long practice. "Do you know why he chose you, girl?" "No," Myra admitted. "I just wanted my lizard back." Bram's clouded eyes drifted up past her, to the vast bowed shape of Ithker still radiating heat and contentment into the afternoon air. "I have a theory, if you'd like to hear an old man's theory." "Sure." "He has watched this pit for 600 years. He has watched candidates come to that chain wearing their finest armor, carrying their sharpest spears, reciting oaths they memorized for a decade, every one of them terrified underneath the ceremony and trying very hard not to show it, because terror, to a beast that size, smells like prey." Bram's voice had gone quiet, almost gentle, the voice of a man who had thought about this for a very long time and rarely had anyone worth saying it to. "You climbed his leg looking for a lizard. You patted his shoulder like he was a nervous horse. You asked him, out loud in front of 40,000 witnesses, whether he was planning to eat your father." A dry, creaking sound that might have been a laugh escaped him. "In 600 years, child, I do not believe anyone has ever once treated Ithker the Cradlebound like he was simply a very large, very good dog who happened to also be terrifying. I think that is precisely why he chose you. Everyone else came to be judged. You came to find your lizard and never once stopped to consider that you might be in danger while you looked." Myra thought about that, scratching the gray kindled's ear while it groaned in bliss and rolled further into her lap. "Pebble's probably still out here somewhere," she said. "Can the kindled help me look for him? They're really good at sniffing." Bram Asa laughed, a real one this time, startled out of him, rusty from disuse but genuine, and Dreeth Corin, watching from the platform with his arms folded, and his careful, reasonable expression fixed firmly back in place, felt something in his chest go tight and cold that had nothing to do with sacred wonder at all. He waited until the pit had emptied, until the elders had filed back into the mountain's deeper halls, and the Voss family had been escorted, blinking, into the ordinary gray afternoon light outside the cradle pit's gates, before he found Ussa Bren alone at the guard post and spoke to her in a voice pitched low enough that even the stone walls would have to strain to hear it. "Captain, I want everything the archive has on the last recorded bonded companion. The Shield daughter 300 years back, how she died, how old the beast was when she did, what happened to him in the years after." He paused, and something moved behind his eyes that was not, whatever Kessa Oran might have believed about him, entirely without its own kind of grief. "And I want to know how long a human child's parents are likely to permit their daughter to keep walking into a monster's den 3 days out of every 7 before somebody, with real authority back on their home colony decides to intervene and pull her out of my jurisdiction entirely." Ussa Bren studied him for a moment too long before she answered. "You're not asking because you're worried for the girl's safety." "I am regent of the Emberhold clans," Dreeth said, "until a warden is confirmed by the cradle. 11 years I have held this seat because no one else could be recognized, and I have held it well, Captain. I have kept the peace, kept the clan lords from each other's throats, kept the treaty with the humans from collapsing into the border war half the council wanted the day their survey ships first entered our sky. I did not do that so that it could all be undone by a 9-year-old girl and her pet lizard." His jaw tightened. "I am not your enemy in this, Captain. I do not wish the child harm. I wish this to end quietly, before the clan lords hear the word *chosen, and decide it means something it does not. And if it does mean something," Ussa said slowly, "steward, if the elder's study finds that a bonded companion carries weight under the old law after all, what then?" Dreeth Corin looked out through the gate, down the ridge toward the small cluster of lights that was Aldergate Landing settling into evening, and did not answer her for a long moment. "Then we will discover," he said finally, "exactly how far I am prepared to go to make sure it does not." Aldergate Landing did not sleep well that night. By the time the Voss family walked back through the outpost's outer airlock, the story had already outrun them. Someone's helmet cam footage from the pit fence had made it onto the colony's local feed within the hour, and by dinner every one of the outpost's 41 families had watched, at least twice. The grainy footage of a small girl in a mud-streaked jacket climbing the shoulder of a beast the size of a building, while 40,000 aliens went dead silent around her. Administrator Holt met them at their dome door before they'd even gotten their boots off. A heavy-set, silver-haired man in his 60s who'd run outposts on 4 different colony worlds and looked, for the first time in the 2 years Myra had known him, genuinely and completely at a loss for what to say. "I've had 6 calls from the Colonial Authority in the last 40 minutes, he said, without preamble, standing in the doorway with his hands jammed in his coverall pockets. 2 from the treaty office, 1 from someone at Xenological Affairs who wanted to know if we had, and I am quoting directly, any idea what we've just done to 6 centuries of Emberhold succession law." He looked past Callum and Priya to where Myra sat on the floor, already peeling off her boots, one of the kindled broodling scent still clinging faintly to her jacket sleeve, where the gray-plated pup had fallen asleep against her for 20 minutes before the pit visit ended. "Priya, Callum. Is she all right?" "She's fine," Priya said, and there was something in her voice, not quite laughter, not quite tears, the particular exhausted wonder of a scientist who had spent 19 years studying alien biology and had just watched her own daughter rewrite 600 years of it by accident. "She's better than fine. She made friends with a war god's puppies, Holt." "That is not," Holt said, going to reassure the Colonial Authority even slightly. "No," Callum agreed, "it really isn't." Myra, only half listening from the floor, looked up. "Can I go back Thursday?" The elder lady said 3 days out of 7. Bram said Ash. "That's the little one with the bent quill, hasn't been weaned off pack milk yet, and I want to see if he's okay." 3 adults looked at her, in 3 different flavors of exhaustion. "We'll talk about it," Priya said, which both of Myra's parents knew, and Myra knew, meant yes, because there had never in 9 years been a way to talk Myra Voss out of something once she'd already decided a small animal needed her. Thursday came, and Myra went back, and Bram Asa was waiting at the gate with the patient, unhurried look of a man who had spent 90 years learning that most things worth doing could not be rushed, and who suspected, correctly, as it turned out, that the next several months were about to become the most interesting of his very long life. The bond did not announce itself all at once after that first violent, silent afternoon. It built the way trust builds with anything wild, in small increments, offered and accepted, neither side quite sure yet what the other one meant by any of it. Myra learned that Ithgar liked to have the loose scale plates behind his jaw scratched, that he made the kettle boil sound when he was pleased, and a deep bone-shaking rumble that meant something closer to stay than asterisk danger, that he would lower his great head to the pit floor and hold utterly, patiently still while she climbed, slow and careful now, up along his foreleg to sit in the warm hollow between his shoulder plates, high enough to see clear across the ridge to where Aldergate's lights blinked on at dusk. The kindled learned her faster than their sire did. By the second week, all 5 of them had abandoned any pretense of caution. They met her at the gate now, tumbling over each other in a scrambling, chittering knot, and the gray-plated one with the head-butting habit, who Myra had named Cobble after 3 days of trying out worse options, had taken to sleeping curled against her side for the entire length of every visit, one clawed paw hooked possessively over her arm as though daring anyone, Varn or human or beast twice his size, to try to move her. It was Bram who first noticed the pattern that would, eventually, matter more than anyone in that pit understood at the time. "Watch Ash," he said, one gray afternoon in the 3rd week, as Myra sat cross-legged in the dust braiding a length of dried grass into a small, lopsided ring for the smallest kindled's bent quill, an idea she'd had after watching the pup wince when it caught the misgrown spine on the den wall one too many times. "Just watch him a moment and tell me what you see." Myra looked. Ash, smallest of the litter, the bent quill runt who'd been slowest to trust anyone, even her, even now, was sitting very still and very straight-backed at the edge of the group, watching her hands work the grass fibers with an intensity none of his litter mates ever showed for anything but food. "He's watching me braid," Myra said. "He is asterisk copying you," Bram said. "Look at his paws." She looked and saw its small clawed forepaws working awkwardly at a loose thread of his own bedding, clumsy, wrong, but unmistakably trying to mimic the over-under motion of her fingers. Myra laughed, delighted, and reached over to guide his paws gently through the motion until, on the fourth try, he managed a single crooked loop and made a triumphant, startled kettle sound that had his 4 litter mates piling over to investigate. "They copy," Bram said quietly, watching all 5 of them now attempting, with wildly varying success, to braid grass fibers under Myra's patient correction. "It's how the kindled learn everything from their sire in the old broods. Before the trials went 11 years without a warden, and Ithker stopped bothering to teach anyone anything at all, because there was no one left he trusted to teach it to. I have not seen a kindled brood learn a new behavior in 4 years, child. Not since the last litter grew and scattered into the high crags without ever once being shown anything but how to hunt and how to be alone." By the 4th week, all 5 kindled wore small, ragged grass braid rings around the base of their quills, lopsided and constantly fraying and endlessly retied, and the pit wardens who stood their long silent watches along the wall had started, without quite admitting it to each other, to find themselves smiling at the sight. Kessa Oran, making her weekly inspection of the bond's progress for the Elder Council's records, watched the 5 kindled troop past in a ragged single-file line behind Myra one gray morning, braided grass rings smoking faintly at the tips where the quills had begun to catch heat again, ash proudly in the middle now instead of hanging back at the edges, and turned to Bram with an expression the old beast keeper had not seen on the elder's face in decades. "What do the wardens call it?" she asked. "There will be a name for it by now. There always is." Bram's weathered mouth curved. "The quiet claiming," he said. Ussa Bren's second, a young warden named Torv, coined it after he watched the girl fix Ash's braid for the 9th time in a single afternoon without once raising her voice or losing patience with him. Says it's the only kind of claiming he's ever seen that a beast this size didn't have to fight for. He shook his head, slow, half in wonder, half in something that looked, on his ancient face, almost like grief for all the years before this one. "The wardens have started doing it themselves, Elder. Braiding cord into their own hair before a long watch. Say it's good luck now. Say it means someone's coming home." Kessa Oran said nothing for a long moment, watching the small human girl and the 5 kindled, and the vast bowed shape of Ithker radiating contentment into the cool mountain air, and did not tell Bram Asa, did not tell anyone, yet that she had already begun, 3 nights running now, drafting the opening clauses of a legal argument that no elder of the Emberhold had needed to make in 600 years, and that she suspected, with the tired certainty of a very old woman who had outlasted 3 regents and buried 2 wardens, that Dreeth Corin already knew exactly what she was writing, and was already several moves ahead of her in deciding what to do about it. Before the trouble that came dressed as an honored guest, there was a smaller trouble first, small enough that Myra herself barely registered it as trouble at all, though Bram Asa would think about it, afterward, as the first true crack in the careful floor Dreeth Corin had spent a decade building. It happened in the 5th week, on an ordinary gray Thursday, when Myra arrived at the pit gate to find the schedule changed without warning. Ussa Bren waiting alone at the fence with an apology already half-formed on her broad, weathered face. "The steward has ordered the lower approach path closed for structural inspection," Ussa said, not quite meeting Myra's eyes, which told Bram, standing a few steps back, everything he needed to know about how much the captain herself believed that explanation. "You'll need to take the east stair instead. It adds perhaps 10 minutes. The east stair, as it turned out, ran directly past the old trial monument, a long wall of carved names, 4 centuries of candidates who had died at the cradle's chain, the 4 most recent added in fresh, still sharp lettering during Dreith Corin's own stewardship. Myra had never walked that route before. Her regular visits had always taken the shorter western path, which avoided the monument entirely. A routing Bram had arranged himself, months earlier, with a quiet word to Ussa Bren, because he had seen no reason a 9-year-old needed to walk past 400 years of the trials cost every single time she came to visit her friends. She stopped in front of the wall anyway, reading the names, working out slowly which 4 belonged to Dreith's own 11 years, and asked Bram, with the same frank directness she brought to everything, "Did Ithker kill all of these people?" Bram Assa had not, at that point, suspected anything worse of Dreith Corin than an 11-year regent's ordinary, understandable desire to keep an unsettling new bond contained and manageable. He answered honestly, from the knowledge he had at the time. "The trial credits their deaths to the beast's judgment, yes. That is what the record says." "But you don't think that's the whole truth," Myra said. It wasn't a question. She had learned over 5 weeks to read the careful edges of what adults chose not to say as clearly as she read what they did. "I think," Bram said slowly, choosing each word the way a man chooses footing on unfamiliar ice, "that I have tended this cradle for 90 years, child, and Ithker has never once, in all that time, killed anything that did not first threaten something he had reason to protect. Territory in the old days before you. His own kindled. I do not know what those 4 candidates did in their final moments that the beast judged worth answering with death. I have simply never fully believed it was nothing more than fear alone. Fear does not usually earn that particular verdict from him. I have watched him meet fear 100 times and simply turn away from it instead." Myra thought about that for a long moment, standing in front of a wall of 400 years of names, and then said the thing that would, months later, turn out to matter considerably more than either of them understood at the time. Maybe somebody should ask the guards who were standing closest when it happened, not what they wrote down after, what they actually saw. Bram Assa did not, that same week, act on a 9-year-old's offhand suggestion. He had no particular reason yet to distrust the official record, and a beastkeeper's authority did not extend to questioning a steward's closed inquiries without cause. But he mentioned it, almost in passing, to Ussa Bren 3 days later, over a shared evening meal at the guard post, and Ussa Bren, who had stood closest of anyone alive to 2 of those 4 deaths, and who had never once in 6 years fully managed to silence her own quiet unease about exactly how conveniently the trapdoor beneath the 4th candidate's feet had given way, did not sleep well that night, or several nights after it. It was a small thing, a child's offhand question, an old man's passing remark, a captain's old unease finally given a shape worth naming. None of it amounted to proof that week of anything at all. But 6 weeks later, when Kessa Oran finally asked Ussa Bren, formally, whether she had ever harbored doubts about the official trial record, the guard captain would not have to search long for where to begin her answer, because a 9-year-old girl looking at a wall of names had already, without meaning to, planted the first seed of the question that would eventually bring the whole careful architecture down. The lower approach path reopened the following week. Its structural inspection concluded with no visible repairs Bram could ever identify, and Myra went back to using the western stair, and did not think about the trial monument again for a long time. But something in Dreith Corin's careful decade-long control had, that week, begun, quietly, almost imperceptibly, to slip. The first real trouble came in the 6th week, and it did not announce itself as trouble at all. It came dressed as an honored guest. Clan Lord Vesic Thane arrived at the Cradle Pit's outer gate on a gray, wind-scoured morning with an honor guard of 20, and a reputation that preceded him by considerably more than that head of the 2nd largest bloodline clan in the Emberhold, a man who had lost a brother to the trial 9 years earlier, and had spent every year since making it clear, in the careful, deniable language of Varn court politics, that he believed Dreeth Corin's long stewardship of the empty seat had gone on exactly 8 years too many. Steward. Vesik's bow was correct to the precise degree required by rank, and not 1 degree further. Word has reached even my hall of the cradle's new guest. I confess I did not believe it until I saw the footage myself. A human child, freely walking these grounds 3 days in 7, while trained candidates of the bloodline clans have died at that chain within living memory. His eyes, pale gold and unreadable, moved past Dreeth to where Myra sat with the kindled brood near the pit's rear wall, close enough to hear but young enough, Vesik clearly hoped, not to fully understand what was about to be discussed above her head. I have come to see it for myself, and I have come, steward, to ask when the Emberhold might expect the Elder Council's ruling on what this bond means for the succession. 11 years is a very long stewardship. The clan lords grow restless. The Elder's study is ongoing, Dreeth said, with a smoothness Myra, listening with half an ear while she worked a fresh grass braid through Cobble's quill, had already learned to recognize as the sound of a man saying nothing while appearing to say a great deal. These matters cannot be rushed, Lord Thane. 600 years of settled law does not unmake itself in 6 weeks. No, Vesik agreed. It seems it required only 1 small girl and a lizard. His gaze settled on Myra again, longer this time, and something in it made Bram Asa, standing a careful 3 steps behind her, shift his weight almost imperceptibly closer. Tell me, child. Are you not afraid, sitting so close to something so large? Myra looked up from the braid, considering the question with the same frank seriousness she gave every question adults asked her, expecting either a trick or genuine curiosity, and unable yet to tell which this was. He's never once hurt me, she said. Why would I be scared of somebody who's never hurt me? Because he has hurt others, Vesik said, and there was something underneath the courtly smoothness now, something testing, something that made Ithgar's low rumble, which had settled over 6 weeks, into a near-constant background hum whenever Myra was within the pitch shift, subtly in pitch. 4 candidates dead in 11 years, girl. Good men, brave men from my own clan among them. Does that not trouble you? Does it not make you wonder what he might yet do, if the wrong moment finds you? It was, Myra understood only much later, a deliberate cruelty dressed as a question, and it worked exactly as Vesik Thane intended it to, though not in the direction he'd hoped. Because Myra thought about it, honestly, the way she thought about everything, and looked past the clan lord to where Ithgar's great head had lifted, watching the exchange with an attention that had gone very still, very focused, in a way that had nothing in it of the lazy afternoon contentment of the past 6 weeks. I don't know why he hurt those other people, Myra said slowly. But I know he's never once made that sound at me. She pointed at the low, building rumble now rolling steadily out of Ithgar's chest, deeper than before, edged with something that had every warden along the wall quietly shifting their spear grips. That sound, he's making it right now. At you. Vesik Thane's honor guard, to their considerable credit, did not need a second warning. They had spent the whole visit standing correctly at ceremonial ease 6 feet behind their lord, and within 2 seconds of Ithgar's rumble deepening into something with real teeth in it, every one of them had closed the distance and formed a loose, tense wall between Vesik and the beast. Ithgar did not charge, he did not need to. He simply rose, unhurried, immense, every ember-lit plate along his flank catching the gray morning light, until his full height blotted out the pit's rear wall entirely, and took 1 slow, deliberate step forward, close enough that his shadow fell across the entire honor guard at once, and stopped there, radiating a warning so total that Myra felt it in the soles of her boots. That, Bram Asa said quietly, into the ringing silence, moving to put himself, gently between the tension and the girl, would be your answer, Lord Thane. I would suggest you not ask her a question like that again in his hearing. Vesik Thane held very still for 3 long seconds, his pale gold eyes fixed on the beast looming over his entire retinue, and when he finally spoke again, His court-smooth voice had gone thin at the edges in a way it clearly cost him effort to hide. "Fascinating," he said. "Truly fascinating, steward, how thoroughly it has attached itself to her." He stepped back, one careful pace, then another, his guard falling back with him in a controlled retreat that did not fully manage to look like anything other than what it was. "I withdraw the question. I withdraw it entirely." A beat. His eyes found Dreeth's. "Though I confess, steward, a beast willing to threaten a clan lord's honor guard over a single unkind question to its bonded child does rather answer the elder council's study for them, does it not? Whatever this bond is, it is not nothing. I do not think it can remain a footnote in your stewardship much longer." He bowed, correct and precise and no longer entirely steady, and withdrew from the pit with his guard close around him, leaving behind a silence that took a full minute to break. It was Dreeth who broke it, crossing the pit floor to where Myra still sat, wide-eyed now, one hand resting flat and unconscious against Cobble's flank as the kindled pup pressed close against her side, 5 small chests all still puffed out with the residual instinct to defend. "He didn't hurt him," Myra said before Dreeth could say anything, a little defensive, a little shaken by how fast the calm afternoon had gone sharp. "I don't think he was gonna. He was just telling him to stop." "I know," Dreeth said, and something in his voice for once was not entirely performance. He crouched, bringing himself to something closer to her eye level, and studied her for a long moment with an expression she wouldn't fully understand until much later, the look of a man doing very fast, very unwilling arithmetic on a problem he had been trying for 6 weeks to convince himself might still shrink if he simply waited long enough. "He was protecting you. Do you understand that, Myra? Not guarding a den, not defending territory." He rose to his full height and threatened one of the most powerful men in the Emberhold clans in front of 20 armed witnesses, because that man asked you an unkind question. He shook his head slow, and for a moment the careful regent's mask slipped enough that Myra saw, underneath it, something that looked almost like exhaustion. "That is not a beast who has chosen a favorite pet child. I do not know what that is. But I am no longer certain I can keep pretending, even to myself, that it is small." That night in his private chambers deep in the Emberhold's stone heart, Dreeth Corin did not sleep. He sat instead at a table stacked with 600 years of trial records. Every candidate, every death, every maiming, every silent unrecorded failure the official histories had smoothed into the beast judged him unworthy. And beside them, in his own hand, a second set of records that existed nowhere in any archive but his own locked strongbox. The names of the pit wardens he had quietly reassigned over 11 years for asking too many questions about certain trial mornings. The trapdoor mechanism, installed by his own order in the 9th year of his stewardship, hidden beneath 3 feet of pit floor dust, that had claimed 2 of the 4 candidates the official histories credited to Ithgar's judgment. The venom-tipped restraint spears, carried by hand-picked guards during trial seasons only, that had slowed a 3rd candidate just enough for the beast's genuine, honest fury provoked, every time, by a test designed to look like tradition and function like a trap, to finish what Dreeth's own arrangements had started. He had told himself, across 11 long years of careful stewardship, that it was mercy, that an empty seat, held steady by his own hand, was safer for the Emberhold than a genuine warden chosen by chance and bloodluck, and a beast whose judgment no one had ever been able to predict. He had told himself the clan lord's endless posturing would tear the Emberhold apart in a season if a weak warden were ever confirmed, and that 11 years of his own careful, unglamorous competence had kept the peace no impulsive young trial winner could have managed. He had never, in 11 years of careful arithmetic, accounted for a 9-year-old human girl who did not want a seat, did not want a title, did not want anything at all except her lizard back and a small gray kindled pup to sleep against her side, and who the beast, for the first time in 600 years of record, had chosen to defend with his entire enormous body rather than simply, coldly, judge. Dreeth Corin looked at the strongbox of his own 11-year architecture of quiet murder dressed as sacred tradition, and understood, with a clarity that settled into his chest like a stone, that a bond this size, witnessed now by a clan lord, by the elder council, by 40,000 Varn who had heard the word chosen echo through the pit 6 weeks ago, and never quite stopped repeating it, could not simply be waited out. It would have to be ended, and it would have to look, to every single witness, like something Ithgar had done himself. The weeks that followed Vesic Thane's visit changed the shape of things, without anyone quite deciding they should. Word of a clan lord backing down from Ithgar's warning traveled through the Emberhold's mountain halls faster than any official announcement could have managed, and the tone of the whispers shifted with it, from chosen to something with more weight behind it, a word that had not needed using in 600 years, and that Kessa Oran, drafting her legal argument late into 3 more nights, had finally allowed herself to write down in the Elder Council's private record. Bondage recognized, the old term, buried in the oldest law scrolls, for a companion the Cradlebound had claimed as more than simply spared. Back at Aldergate Landing, the pressure ran the opposite direction. The colonial authority sent a formal inquiry, then a second, then a liaison officer named Price who flew in on the monthly supply shuttle specifically to sit across from Callum and Priya Voss in their own dome and ask, with careful bureaucratic patience, whether they had considered that their daughter's continued presence at the Cradle Pit constituted an unacceptable and escalating risk that the authority might soon feel obligated to formally intervene in. "She's not in danger," Priya said, for what felt like the 40th time in 3 months, sitting very straight at her own kitchen table with the particular controlled calm of a scientist who had run the actual data and was tired of explaining it to people who hadn't. "I have 6 weeks of behavioral observation, Officer Price. I have thermal imaging of a creature the size of a transport shuttle deliberately, repeatedly moderating its own body temperature, so it doesn't overheat a 9-year-old sitting against its flank. I have footage of a clan lord's 20-strong honor guard retreating from a threat display, aimed entirely at protecting my daughter's feelings. If you want to talk about risk, I would very much like to see your data, because mine says the single safest place on this entire world for my daughter to be, 3 days out of 7, is inside that pit. With respect, Dr. Voss, that's a scientist's read on an alien apex predator's behavior, and I understand your expertise, I do, but the authorities' concern isn't only whether the beast itself poses a threat. It's the political situation your daughter has become the center of, clan lords, succession disputes, a regent who by your own account has already once discussed, in her hearing, ending the arrangement." Price set a data slate on the table between them, its screen already open to a threat assessment that had clearly cost someone back at the authority's regional office a great deal of careful, worried drafting. "We're not questioning the beast's affection for her. We're questioning whether an 11-year-old treaty and a 600-year-old succession crisis is a safe place for a 9-year-old girl to be standing in the middle of, regardless of how gentle the monster is." It was Myra herself, home early from a Thursday visit and catching the tail end of the conversation from the dome's hallway, who finally answered that one, in the flat, unimpressed voice of a child who had heard adults talk around her for 3 months now and had run entirely out of patience for it. "Cobble's scared of thunder," she said from the doorway, and every adult at the table turned to look at her. "He hides his face under my arm when the storms come through the ridge. Ash still can't get his braid right without help, even though I've shown him like 40 times. The elder lady is writing a whole legal thing about whether I get to keep visiting, and I don't even want a seat or a title or whatever. I just want to keep going on Thursdays." She crossed her arms, exactly the way her mother did when she'd made up her mind about something and intended to hold the line. "You can send all the officers you want. I'm not gonna stop going. If you make me stop going, Ithgar's gonna do that scary rumble thing at everybody, and it'll be your fault, not mine." Officer Price looked, for a long moment, entirely at a loss for how to file that particular statement into a threat assessment. He flew back out on the next shuttle 3 days later, and the authorities' formal inquiries, while they did not stop, slowed considerably. Because whatever risk equation the bureaucrats back at the regional office were running, none of them had an answer for a beast that had, by then, made the evening feed twice more. Once bowing its great head so the smallest kindled could scramble up its tusk to reach a nesting bird's egg Myra wanted to look at without touching. And once, the clip that finally, genuinely, ended most of the debate back on the colonial authorities' homeworld, standing motionless for 11 full minutes in a driving mountain rainstorm, so its bulk could shelter Myra, and all 5 kindled from the worst of it, while Bram Asa fetched dry cloaks from the gatehouse. Ash's bent quill over those same weeks slowly straightened. Bram said it happened sometimes in young kindled, if the growth wasn't too severe, and the joint wasn't given reason to seize up crooked. But he also said, quietly, to Kessa Orun rather than to Myra, that he had never once in 90 years seen it happen this fast, or seen a runt kindled go from the last of his litter to fed at his sire's shoulder before all 4 of his siblings. Simply because a small human girl had spent 3 months making sure he never once felt slow, or small, or last in line for anything. By the 3rd month, Cobble had grown to the size of a small pony, his head-butting habit now capable of knocking a grown pit warden clean off his feet if he forgot to brace, though he had never once, not even accidentally, done it to Myra. The braided grass rings around the kindled's quills had become a fixture of the pit's daily rhythm. Young Warden Torv kept a fresh supply of dried grass cord in his own gear now, retying frayed braids on quiet mornings before Myra arrived, because it had become, in the warden's quiet, unofficial way, something like a duty of honor to keep the cradle's newest and oldest traditions both properly maintained. It was around this same time that Aldergate Landing's small schoolroom acquired a tradition none of the colony's teaching staff had planned for, and none of them, once it arrived, had the heart to discourage. Myra had taken, on the days she wasn't at the pit, to bringing her homework outside during the mild afternoons, and more than once a scatter of the colony's other children, 11 of them, all told, ranging from 6 to 13, the whole of Aldergate's small school-age population, had drifted out to sit with her rather than stay indoors, drawn less by the schoolwork than by the increasingly regular sight of a kindled or 2 loping down from the ridge to check on her between visits. It was Cobble, inevitably, who started it, trotting down the ridge path one bright afternoon, finding the whole knot of human children clustered around Myra's outdoor lesson table, and after a long, deliberating study of the unfamiliar small humans, deciding the safest and most efficient way to greet the group at large was to flop down in the middle of them and present his belly, exactly the way he'd learned, months earlier, was the correct response to any human showing him kindness. 6-year-old Dara Akafer, who had never in her life been within 30 feet of anything larger than the colony's water reclamation drones, shrieked in a mixture of terror and delight, and within a week had appointed herself, with great and serious ceremony, Cobble's official, second helper, a role that appeared to consist mainly of supervising his belly rubs and reporting daily on his mood to anyone who would listen. Administrator Holt, watching this development unfold from his office window with the particular resigned fondness of a man who had stopped fighting the inevitable months earlier, filed it, in his own private records, under a heading he never once let the colonial authorities see: Auxiliary Educational Enrichment, unbudgeted, extremely popular. By the time the colony's next quarterly report came due, 4 separate families had independently begun referring to the outdoor lesson hour as Beast Class, a name that stuck hard enough that Torv, on one of his own visits down from the Ember Hold, solemnly adopted it into the warden's own vocabulary and began, half as a joke and half not, drafting an actual lesson plan: how to read a kindled's mood from its ear set, how to offer a hand properly. What a low growl meant against a high one, that the elder council, to Holt's visible astonishment, eventually approved as a genuine addition to both the colony schools and the Emberhold's own novice warden curriculum. Ash, of all the kindled, took to beast class with the most unexpected enthusiasm, arriving most afternoons to sit, patient and watchful, at the center of the gathered children, while they took turns practicing the braid-and-release grip Myra had taught them on his own carefully maintained quill ring. And Bram Asa, observing one such afternoon with quiet private wonder, remarked to Kessa Oran that he had begun to suspect the run of Ithgar's brood, once the smallest, slowest, most anxious of the litter, might grow, in time, into something the Emberhold had never once had cause to imagine needing: a kindled gentle and patient enough to teach children, both human and Varn, exactly the lesson its own crooked quill had once taught it about difference not being the same thing as lesser. It was against this backdrop, the bond deepening past anything even Kessa Oran's careful legal drafting had fully anticipated, the clan lord's restless whispers sharpening into something closer to organized pressure, the colonial authorities' inquiries slowing but not stopping, and a small human schoolroom quietly, cheerfully absorbing an alien war beast's brood into its daily rhythm as though it had always belonged there, that Dreeth Corin finally decided the waiting had gone on long enough. He did not move quickly. He had spent 11 years learning that quick moves in Emberhold politics left fingerprints, and he had every intention of leaving none. Instead, in the 4th month of the bond, he called a full trial council session, the first in 11 years, and proposed, in the reasonable, careful voice that had kept him unchallenged for a decade, a ceremony to formally test the depth and safety of what the Elder Council's own study had, by now, tentatively begun calling a bondage recognition. "If the girl's bond with Ithgar is genuine," he told the assembled elders, Kessa Oran watching him with an expression that gave away nothing at all, "then it should hold under the same conditions our law has always used to test a candidate's true standing, not the outer pit, where the beast is calm and rested and has had 4 months to grow accustomed to her presence, but the lower chamber, the old testing hollow, where a bond, if it is real, should hold exactly as strong, and where, if it is not, if what we are watching is simply a very large, very patient predator that has not yet decided the child is prey, we will learn that safely, under full council witness, rather than risk discovering it some quiet Thursday with no one watching at all." It was, on its face, exactly the kind of caution a careful steward should propose. Kessa Oran, listening, felt the old cold instinct she had carried through 3 regencies stir at the back of her skull, the sense of a man laying groundwork with great care for something he had already decided the outcome of, but she had no proof, no fact she could set against Dreeth's reasonable words. Only 61 years of watching men build arguments for things they wanted long before they let anyone see the want itself. "The lower chamber has not been used in a trial in over 40 years, she said instead, carefully. "It was retired after the collapse of the Eastern Gallery. Half its old restraint mechanisms have not been inspected since." "Then we will inspect them," Dreeth said smoothly, "before the ceremony. I will see to it personally." And that, Kessa Oran would think much later, lying awake in the small hours after everything had finally come apart in the open air where everyone could see it, was the moment she should have understood exactly what he meant to do. Because a regent who wished a testing chamber made safe did not, as a rule, insist on overseeing its restoration personally, alone, with no elder witness present, 3 full weeks before the ceremony he had proposed would take place. Bram Asa did not like it either, though it took him longer to say so aloud, and when he finally did, it was to Myra herself, on a quiet Thursday afternoon while she sat weaving a new, larger braid ring for Cobble's quill, the old one having finally, proudly, been outgrown. "The lower chamber," he said, settling onto the stone beside her with the careful economy of an old man's joints, "is not like the pit, child. I want you to understand that before the ceremony comes. The pit is open sky, wide floor, room enough for Ithgar to move as he pleases and for anyone in it to run if running becomes necessary. The lower chamber is stone on every side, narrow. It was built 400 years ago to test candidates under pressure, to see whether a bloodline warrior's courage held when there was nowhere left to retreat to. His clouded eyes studied her, unusually grave. It has restraint mechanisms built into the walls, chain anchors, a gallery gate that seals from outside, so the elders may observe without themselves being at risk. I do not like that the steward has spent 3 weeks overseeing its restoration, with no elder present to witness what precisely he has restored. You think he's gonna do something, Myra said. It wasn't quite a question. I do not know what I think, Bram admitted, which for a man of his age and careful habits of speech was very nearly a confession. I have served 3 wardens and watched 11 years of a 4th's absence, child, and in all that time I have never once caught Dreeth Corin in an open lie. He is careful. He is patient. He has, by most measures, kept this Emberhold from tearing itself apart for a decade, and I do not believe he is a man without honor entirely. He was quiet a moment, watching Ithgar doze in the afternoon sun, the fresh braided kindled sprawled across his forelegs in a warm, chittering pile. But I have also watched him, these past 4 months, do arithmetic behind his eyes every single time your bond with that beast grows 1 inch stronger. And I do not think a man does that kind of arithmetic, for that long, without eventually reaching for a total. Callum and Priya Voss, when Kessa Oran herself came to their dome 3 nights before the ceremony to lay out, as plainly as elder council propriety allowed her to, her own unspoken doubts about the lower chamber's sudden restoration had exactly the argument every parent in their position would have. Then she doesn't go, Callum said flatly, standing in the middle of the small kitchen with his arms crossed, every line of him braced for a fight. I don't care what your law says a bondage recognition ceremony requires. She's 9. She's not risking a sealed stone chamber and a beast that's never been tested under those conditions, because a man you yourself just told us you don't fully trust wants to run an experiment. I understand your fear, and I do not say it is unfounded, Kessa said, with the unhurried patience of a woman who had delivered this exact kind of hard news to parents before, in other contexts, across 61 years of service. But I must tell you plainly what refusal will cost, so that you choose it with full knowledge rather than blind hope. If the girl does not attend, the council cannot rule the bond has been formally tested. Every clan lord who has watched their own candidates die at that chain across 6 centuries will say, forever after, that the human child's bond was never proven, only assumed, only performed for cameras and audiences who never saw it held to the same standard every Varn candidate has always been held to. Vesic Thane will say it loudest of all, and he will not be wrong to, by our own law's letter. The bond may survive that whisper campaign. I do not know that it will. 6 centuries of tradition is a very heavy thing to ask 40,000 people to set aside on faith alone. And if we do let her go and it's a trap, Priya said, low and hard, what does that cost? Kessa Oran did not have a good answer for that, and to her considerable credit, she did not pretend to. I cannot promise you it is not a trap, she said. I can only promise you that I, and Bram Asa, and every warden under Ussa Bren's command who has watched that bond grow for 4 months, will be standing at that gallery gate with our own eyes open, and that if Dreeth Corin has built something into that chamber meant to end what I believe, in my heart, is the truest thing I have witnessed in 61 years of service to this cradle, he will answer for it in front of every elder and every clan lord in the Emberhold. And I will make certain of that myself. It was Myra in the end who decided it, the way she decided most things, by walking into the kitchen in her sock feet at 9 o'clock at night, having heard most of the last 20 minutes through the thin dome wall, and saying, with the flat, unbothered certainty of a child who trusted an enormous beast more than she trusted most adults' careful political calculations, Ithgar's not gonna let anything happen to me. He never has, I'm going." Her parents looked at each other for a long, silent moment across the kitchen table. The look of two people who had spent 4 months watching a monster prove, over and over, in 100 small, careful gestures, that it would rather die than see their daughter come to harm, and who had run out of arguments that could stand against that evidence, however much they wanted one. "We're coming with you," Callum said finally, "every step. And if anything feels wrong in that chamber, we're getting you out, treaty or no treaty, council or no council." "Okay," Myra said, already turning back toward her room, entirely unbothered because in her 9-year-old accounting of the world, this had never once been a question worth losing sleep over. "Can I bring Cobble's new braid ring? I finished it tonight. He likes having a spare." The lower chamber was everything Bram had warned it would be, and worse for the seeing of it. Myra stood at its center on the morning of the ceremony, in a wide stone bowl cut 40 feet down into the mountain's bones, walls smooth and sheer on every side, broken only by the sealed gallery gate 30 feet up where the elder council, the clan lords, her parents, and what felt like half the Emberhold's ranking nobility stood crowded along a narrow observation rail. Old chain anchors, rust-dark with age, ringed the chamber floor at regular intervals. Restraint points, Bram had explained, meant in the old ceremonies to hold a candidate's ceremonial tether so the beast's approach could be measured, tested, controlled. Ithgar entered through the chamber's lower gate the way he entered everything now when Myra was near, unhurried, Ember Eyes already finding her across the width of the stone bowl, the low welcome rumble starting in his chest before his second full stride. The 5 kindled, freshly braided, scrambled in ahead of him and made straight for her, and for one long, warm moment the whole terrible weight of the chamber's architecture seemed to matter less than it should have, because it was just Thursday, just the pit, just her friends. Then the gallery gate sealed with a heavy stone groan, and Dreeth Corin's voice, amplified by the chamber's old acoustic channels, rolled down from the observation rail. "Let the ceremony begin. The bondage recognition of the human child Myra Voss will now be tested under the old law's full conditions." A pause, careful, measured. "Release the trial beast." Bram Asa, standing at Myra's shoulder inside the chamber itself. He had insisted, over 3 separate objections, on his right as cradle keeper to stand with her rather than watch from the gallery, went very still. "There is no trial beast in the old law," he said, quiet, urgent, already turning toward the sealed gallery gate. "The old law tests the asterisk candidate's courage before the cradle-bound alone. There has never in 400 years been a second beast in this chamber during a grinding, mechanical shriek cut him off, one of the chamber's lower wall sections sliding open on gears that had clearly, despite Kessa Orun's earlier concerns, been very thoroughly restored. And out of the dark opening came something Myra had never seen before and would remember in her worst dreams for years afterward. A lean, scale-hided predator the size of a large horse, starved thin, wild-eyed, driven half-mad by weeks of deliberate isolation and hunger in the dark beneath the chamber, its jaws already wide and shrieking with a fury that had nothing gentle in it at all. A hunger beast, Bram breathed, already moving, already too far away, already too old to close the distance in time. He starved a hunger beast for weeks and hid it beneath the chamber child, get asterisk behind. Myra did not have time to get behind anything. The hunger beast crossed 30 feet of open stone floor in under 2 seconds, and every single account given afterward, Kessa Orun's from the gallery rail, Ussa Bren's from the sealed gate, Priya Voss's, screaming her daughter's name against stone that would not open fast enough, agreed on exactly one thing. That Ithgar the cradle-bound, untamable for 600 years, chained by nothing but his own 600-year choice to remain within the boundaries the Emberhold had built for him, did not hesitate for even the length of a single heartbeat. He moved between Myra and the hunger beast the way, A mountain moves when a mountain has decided, finally, after 10,000 years, that it is done being patient. The impact when the two beasts met shook dust from the chamber's 40-foot walls. Myra was thrown backward by the shockwave of it, caught barely, desperately, by Bram Assa's old but sure hands, and from the ground, from behind the old beast keeper's braced legs, she watched Ithgar do something that would be spoken of in the Ember Hold for the rest of its long history. He did not simply kill the hunger beast, though he could have, in a single motion, with the terrible efficient speed of an apex predator, finally using the whole of what 600 years had made him. He drove it back step by step, tusk against claw, his own hide taking gashes that welled dark and steaming in the cold chamber air, away from Myra, away from Bram, away from the small terrified knot of kindled screaming their own furious undersized battle cries from the chamber's edge, and pinned it at last against the sealed lower gate it had come through. One massive foreleg planted across its throat, holding it there, alive, thrashing, contained rather than ended. Because Ithgar the cradle-bound understood, in whatever ancient and patient way a creature of his kind understood anything, that the true enemy in that chamber was not the starved and maddened thing he had just broken to a standstill. It was the sealed gallery gate above, and the man standing behind it, and the 600 years of careful law that man had just shattered with his own hand in front of every witness who mattered. Ithgar threw back his great head and made a sound the chamber had never once, in 400 years of ceremonies, been built to hold. It was not the welcome rumble. It was not the warning growl that had sent Vesic Thane's honor guard into retreat. It was a roar that cracked stone dust loose from the gallery rail 30 feet up, that had every clan lord and elder along that rail stumbling back from the edge, that rolled out across the whole mountain stone bones and reached, Bram Assa would say later, all the way down to Aldergate Landing itself, where 41 families stepped out of their domes into the gray morning and looked up at the ridge in silence. Then, still holding the hunger beast pinned and breathing hard beneath one massive foreleg, Ithgar the cradle-bound turned his furnace-orange eyes up to the sealed gallery gate, found Dreeth Corin's face among the crowd of stunned witnesses, and held his gaze there, unblinking, ancient, absolutely and completely certain, for 5 full seconds that felt, to everyone who stood in that chamber or watched from above it, considerably longer. Kessa Aurun, standing at the gallery rail with her old hands white-knuckled on the stone, was the first to find her voice. "Open the lower gate," she said, and though her voice shook, it did not waver. "Get the guard captain and every warden she can spare down into that chamber now, and someone bind that hunger beast before it comes to its senses, and steward." She turned, slow, deliberate, to where Dreeth Corin stood frozen at the rail, his careful, reasonable mask finally, completely gone. "You will not leave this gallery. Not one step, until every elder present has heard, in full, exactly how a starved hunger beast came to be sealed beneath a ceremonial chamber you personally oversaw the restoration of, alone, with no elder witness present, 3 weeks before you proposed this test." The lower gate ground open, and Ussa Bren's guards poured through it with practiced speed, binding cords already uncoiled, moving on the hunger beast the instant Ithgar released his grip on its throat and stepped back to allow them room. But it was not the guards Myra went to first. She was on her feet and across the chamber before Bram Assa's hand could close on her shoulder to stop her, straight toward the deep gash along Ithgar's flank, where the hunger beast's claws had opened 3 long furrows through the ember-plated hide. "You're bleeding," she said, and there was no fear in it at all, only the same flat practical concern she'd shown Ash's crooked quill 4 months earlier, already pulling off her jacket to press against the worst of the wound the way her mother had taught her to do for smaller hurts, years ago on smaller animals. "Hold still. I know it probably doesn't help much. You're really big and I'm really small, but hold still anyway." Ithgar went still. Not the coiled stillness of a moment ago, not even the patient waiting stillness of an ordinary Thursday afternoon. Something quieter than either. something that had every warden freezing mid-motion to watch a beast large enough to level the chamber around them lower his great head, gingerly, carefully, until his furnace eye rested no more than a foot from where a 9-year-old girl in a mud-streaked jacket pressed her whole slight weight against a wound that could have swallowed her twice over, and made a low, rough, wondering sound that Bram Asa, finally reaching her side, finally close enough to help, would later say he had no name for it all. Because in 90 years of service, he had never once had cause to learn the sound a 600-year-old beast makes the first time in its whole long life that anything smaller than itself has tried to take care of it instead of the other way around. "He'll heal faster than any of us could help with," Bram said gently, easing her back half a step, checking the wound himself with an old healer's practiced hands even as he said it. "But I don't imagine he'll ever forget that you tried." He glanced up and found the beast's great eye fixed not on the wound at all now, but on the small human girl still crouched at his side, an expression on that vast ancient face that no trial record in 600 years had ever once described, because no trial record had ever had reason to. What Dreith Corin did next would be recounted, argued over, and eventually carved into the Emberhold's own long memory as the precise moment his 11 years of careful stewardship ended. Not with the hunger beast, which every honest witness in that gallery understood by then had been his doing, but with what he chose to do once he understood he had been caught. He did not deny it. He did not, to his very small remaining credit, try to claim innocence in front of 40 witnesses who had just heard Ithgar's roar shake dust from the mountain's own bones. Instead, in the 3 seconds before Usabren's guards could reach him, Dreith Corin turned to the 2 men of his own personal retinue standing nearest the gallery rail, men he had placed there himself, quietly, over 11 careful years, men whose loyalty ran to him and not to the elder council or the old law, and gave them an order in a voice gone thin and desperate, and entirely unlike the smooth, reasonable regent the Emberhold had known for a decade. "Get the girl out of the chamber, now, before the council can question her. If she cannot speak to what she saw, there is no witness who can place the beast's release before my order." It was, Kessa Oran would say afterward, the single worst decision available to him in that entire terrible morning, and he made it anyway, because a man who has spent 11 years building an architecture of careful lies does not stop thinking in architecture even when the whole structure is already coming down around his ears. His 2 men moved fast, cutting through the stunned crowd along the gallery rail toward the narrow stair that led down into the chamber itself, and for one heart-stopping moment, it looked as though they might genuinely reach it before Usabren's own guards could close the gap. They did not reach the stair. Kabul reached it first. The gray-plated kindled, no longer small, no longer a pup at all in anything but temperament, grown over 4 months to the size of a young horse under Myra's constant patient care, had spent the entire chamber battle screaming his small furious battle cry from the edges alongside his litter mates, unable to reach the fight, unable to help, every instinct in his body straining toward the girl he had claimed as his own on the very first afternoon she'd scratched behind his jaw. When Dreith's 2 men broke from the gallery rail and started down the narrow stair toward that same girl, 4 months of pent-up protective fury finally had somewhere to go. He hit the stairwell entrance like a landslide. Ash and the other 3 kindled a half-step behind him, and the 2 men who had been sent to silence a 9-year-old witness found themselves, in the space of 2 seconds, facing 5 plated, snarling, entirely serious young predators who had spent 4 months learning exactly one lesson from their sire and their bonded girl both: that some things you simply do not allow to happen, whatever the cost of stopping them. Neither man was seriously hurt. Usabren's own guards would confirm as much within the hour, once they'd hauled both of them off the stairwell floor, considerably chastened, one nursing a badly wrenched shoulder, and both of them soaked through with the particular fear that comes from discovering up close exactly how much restraint a young predator can show even in the full grip of protective fury, if it has spent its entire short life being taught, gently, patiently, that hurting things wasn't the only way to stop them. Cobble had simply put himself, immovable as a landslide, between the two men and the stairwell, and let the sheer scale of 5 snarling kindled do the rest of the convincing. It was, Torv the young warden would say later, exactly the kind of restraint no candidate in 400 years of trial records had ever managed to show while genuinely afraid for someone they loved. And it was, more than the hunger beast, more than Ithgar's roar, more than any single piece of evidence Ussa Bren would eventually pull from Dreeth Corin's private strongbox, the thing that finally, completely, turned the watching elders' faces to stone against him. They found the strongbox that same afternoon, in Dreeth's own chambers, under a search order Kessa Oran signed with a hand that did not shake despite the 61 years of careful neutrality she had just set entirely aside. Inside it, 11 years of trapdoor schematics, guard reassignment orders, and a private ledger, kept in Dreeth's own careful hand, that traced, in cold administrative detail, exactly which of the 4 trial deaths credited to Ithgar's judgment across a decade had, in fact, been engineered, quietly, patiently, dressed always in the reasonable language of tradition and safety, by the regent sworn to serve the very law he had spent 11 years secretly murdering candidates to keep from ever being tested. Ussa Bren, reading through the ledger in the sealed council chamber that evening with Kessa Oran at her shoulder, found her own name in it twice, both times in a list of wardens Dreeth had considered reassigning for asking too many questions about the third candidate's death. 6 years passed. A young trial hopeful named Yoren, whose family had never stopped, quietly, respectfully, asking for a fuller accounting than the official record gave them. I served him for 11 years, Ussa Bren said, very quietly, closing the ledger with hands that had gone entirely steady in a way that frightened her more than shaking would have. I stood at that pit rail every trial season and told myself the beast's judgment was simply harsh, that the old ways had always claimed a price, that it was not my place to question a law older than either of us. She looked up at Kessa Oran, and something in her broad, weathered face had gone very hard. Elder, I would like to be the one who reads this ledger aloud to the full council at the formal judgment. Yoren's family deserves to hear it from someone who owes them an apology, not simply a verdict. The formal judgment was held 3 days later, in the great open amphitheater at the Emberhold's mountain heart, before every clan lord, every elder, and, at Kessa Oran's specific, deliberate insistence, every family who had ever lost a trial candidate across 11 years of Dreeth Corin's careful stewardship. Myra sat in the front tier beside her parents, Cobble's great gray head resting heavy and warm across her lap, Ash curled against her other side with his once crooked quill grown straight and strong, and watched a man who had, 4 months earlier, greeted her with careful reasonable warmth across a low stone table, stand alone in the amphitheater's center while Ussa Bren read Yoren's name aloud, and then the second name, and then the third, and then the fourth. Each one landing on the silent tears like a stone, dropped into still water. Dreeth Corin did not deny a single word of it. Something in him, the last careful architecture of the reasonable, competent regent he had spent 11 years building himself into, had simply come apart somewhere in the 3 days since the hunger beast, and what stood in the amphitheater's center now was a much smaller, much older-looking man than the one who had folded himself so gracefully onto a cushion across from a 9-year-old girl, and told her, warmly, that he only wished to speak with their young guest. I told myself I was keeping the peace, he said, when Kessa Oran finally asked him formally before the full council whether he had anything to offer in his own defense. 11 years, I told myself the seat was safer empty and steady in my hand than filled by whatever bloodluck the trial produced next. I told myself 4 deaths, spread carefully across a decade, dressed always as tradition, was a smaller cost than a border war between the clan lords, or a weak warden's incompetence unraveling everything I had built to hold the peace together. He looked, finally, not at the council, not at the clan lords, but down at the frontier, at the small human girl watching him with the same frank, unblinking attention she had given him across a low stone table 4 months earlier, one hand still resting on the great gray head in her lap. I do not know how to explain to any of you what it was like, watching a 9-year-old child do in 4 months, without once trying, what I could not do in 11 years of careful, deliberate effort, earn that beast's trust honestly. I told myself I was protecting the Emberhold from chaos. His voice, for the first time in the whole proceeding, cracked, just slightly, just once. I understand now that I was protecting my own seat, and calling it something nobler, for so long that I had genuinely stopped being able to tell the difference. An old woman rose from the frontier before Kessa Oran could call the proceeding to its verdict, small, gray-robed, leaning on a cane carved from the same dark mountain wood as half the Emberhold's oldest furniture, and the whole amphitheater fell quieter still, because everyone present knew her, or knew of her. Yoren's grandmother, who had raised the boy herself after his parents died in a rockslide, and who had spent 6 years quietly, respectfully, asking for an accounting the official record had never once given her. "I do not want your exile service," she said, and her voice, though thin with age, carried to the amphitheater's farthest tier without a single tremor in it. "I do not want your seasonal apologies, Dreeth Corin. I have imagined, more nights than I can count, exactly what I would want from you if this day ever came, and I confess it was rarely so gentle as what the elders are about to hand down." She was quiet a moment, and when she spoke again, some of the iron had gone out of her voice, leaving something more tired and more human beneath it. "But I find, now that the day has actually arrived, that I do not want vengeance either. I want only this, that you say his name yourself once here, where every clan lord and every elder can hear you say it, and admit that Yoren Asa was not judged unworthy by any beast at all. He was murdered by a man who valued his own comfortable seat above a boy's honest courage. Say it plainly. Then I am finished with you, and you may go wherever the council sends you. And I hope, sincerely, that the rest of your life gives you a great deal of quiet time to think about what an honest trial would have cost you, against what your dishonest one has now cost everyone." Dreeth Corin looked at her for a long moment, and something in his face, the last careful remnant of the regent who had once believed his own arithmetic, finally, completely broke. "Yoren Asa was not judged unworthy by the cradle-bound," he said, and his voice did not waver, though it clearly cost him everything he had left to keep it steady. "He was murdered, by me, because I valued my seat above his courage, and I have no honest word left to soften that with." He bowed to her, low, the full formal bow of a supplicant to an elder, the first entirely unperformed gesture anyone in that amphitheater had seen him make in 11 years. "I am sorry. I know it costs you nothing and changes nothing. I am sorry regardless." Yoren's grandmother studied him a moment longer, then nodded once, sat back down without another word, and did not look at him again for the remainder of the proceeding, which everyone present understood, better than any formal sentence the council could hand down, as its own complete and permanent verdict. The council's judgment, when it came, was not swift, and it was not gentle. Dreeth Corin was stripped of the regency on the spot, his ceremonial robes taken from him in front of the full amphitheater by Kessa Oran's own hand. A formal disgrace older, Bram Asa murmured to Myra, than the written law itself, reserved for the rarest and gravest breaches of a steward's trust. He was not executed. The elders were, on that point, unanimous and unbending, arguing long into the evening that a regency built on secret murder should not be answered with more of the same, however satisfying some of the clan lords clearly found the idea. Instead, he was sentenced to the old exile service, stripped of rank, name, and clan standing, sent to labor for the remainder of his years in the deep mining tunnels beneath the eastern gallery, under guard, with no voice in Emberhold politics ever again, and required, once a season for the rest of his life, to stand before Yoren's family and the families of the other three, and answer in person any question they still wished to ask him. Vesic Thane, who had smelled the seat's weakness for years and pressed on it at every opportunity, found himself, in the judgment's aftermath, considerably less pleased than he had expected to be. Because the scandal that toppled Dreith Corin toppled, along with him, the entire 11-year argument that a strong, quietly ruthless steward was preferable to an honest, untested one. And the clan lords who had quietly backed Vesic's ambitions for exactly that reason found their appetite for his particular brand of hard-eyed pragmatism considerably diminished by the sight of where it had led the last man who'd practiced it. The succession question itself took longer to settle than the judgment had, and settled in the end, exactly the way Kessa Oran had known in her heart it would from the very first afternoon she watched Ithgar bow his great head to a 9-year-old human girl in the dust of the cradle pit. The Elder Council ruled, after 6 more weeks of careful deliberation, and a great deal of consultation with archives no one had opened in 3 centuries, that the warden's seat itself could not, under any reading of Emberhold law old or new, pass to a human child, a ruling Myra herself, when it was explained to her, greeted with visible relief rather than disappointment, because, as she put it to Bram Asa with her usual flat clarity, "I don't want to run a whole mountain kingdom. I have homework." But the council also ruled in the same session that Ithgar the Cradlebound's bondage recognition of her stood, fully, formally, permanently, as the truest and clearest proof the Emberhold had ever possessed of what the old trial had always actually been testing for, 600 years and 600 misunderstandings deep. Not bloodline, not rank, not the correct oaths recited in the correct order, but the simple, rare, unfakeable thing Dreith Corin had spent 11 careful years failing to counterfeit, and a small human girl had offered without once trying to. The trial, Kessa Oran ruled, would resume, properly, honestly, for the first time in over a decade, with every hidden mechanism in every chamber stripped out and inspected by wardens loyal to nothing but the truth of what the beast actually decided. And any Varn candidate the Cradlebound himself chose to recognize, freely, without trap or trick or manufactured tragedy, would take the seat that had stood empty for 11 years. Myra Voss, meanwhile, was granted a standing the old law scrolls had a name for after all, buried deep enough in the archive that Bram Asa had to search 3 days to find it. Cradle Ward, a title last held 300 years earlier by the Shield daughter, whose bond with an earlier Ithgar the old histories still remembered with such careful reverence. It came with no political power, no seat, no vote in the council, only the standing right, unquestioned and unquestionable for as long as she lived, to walk into the cradle pit whenever she wished, and the quieter, less official honor of being, as Torv the young warden put it with a grin the first time he braided a fresh cord into his own hair before her visit, the only person in 600 years the cradle actually likes better than tradition. The treaty between Aldergate Landing and the Emberhold clans, which had wobbled and nearly broken a dozen times across 4 turbulent months, was formally renewed and strengthened within the season, not despite everything that had happened, but because of it, because 41 human families and 40,000 Varn had all watched together. An entire mountain empire's oldest institution prove itself capable of tearing down its own corruption rather than protecting it. And there was no better foundation for trust between 2 peoples than watching each other choose, under real pressure, to do the harder right thing. Administrator Holt, presiding over the renewal ceremony from the human side with the particular weary pride of a man who had spent 2 years quietly certain the Aldergate Treaty would eventually collapse under its own fragility, watched Myra Voss stand at the ceremony's edge with a fully grown, kindled the size of a small pony, leaning its great gray head against her shoulder, and murmured to Priya, not for the first time, that he had genuinely never expected his outpost's most significant diplomatic achievement to be accomplished by a 9-year-old chasing a lizard. To be fair, Priya said, watching her daughter laugh at something Ash had done with his own, now permanent, perfectly straight braid, neither did I. The first honest trial in 11 years was held at the turn of the season, and Myra Voss watched it from a seat of honor beside Kessa Oran on the elder platform. Cobble's great gray bulk settled protectively behind her chair. Ash curled at her feet with his straight quill catching the morning light. The candidate was a young warden Myra already knew, Torv, the very same second who had first coined the name for what the wardens now called, without a hint of irony, the quiet claiming, and who had spent every quiet morning of the last 4 months rebraiding frayed cord into his own hair before a long watch, half in tradition and half, though he'd never quite said it aloud, in hope. He came to the chain in plain warden's armor, no ceremonial finery, no rehearsed oath. Kessa Oran's new rules for the restored trial forbade both. On the theory, unproven until that morning but soon to be thoroughly vindicated, that a beast who had spent 600 years watching candidates perform courage might respond rather better to a candidate who simply, honestly, felt it. He was afraid. Everyone in the amphitheater could see it, and under the old regime that fear alone might have been reason enough for the outcome that followed to feel like a foregone conclusion, a formality, a death delayed only by whichever mechanism Dreeth Corin's absence had left unset. But Torv did not try to hide the fear, did not straighten his shoulders into a performance of bravery he didn't feel. He simply walked to the chain, knelt at its end the way the old law required, and said, in a voice that shook only a little, "I don't know if I'm what you're looking for. I've watched you 6 months now, guarding a girl who never once had to prove anything to earn it. I don't know how to prove anything either. I just know I'd stand where she stood if you'd let me." Ithgar considered him for a long, silent moment, long enough that Kessa Oran's old hands went tight on the platform rail, despite the promise she had made herself, months earlier, to trust whatever the beast decided honestly rather than fear it the way the old broken law had trained everyone to. Then the great head lowered, slow, deliberate, until the furnace-orange eye was level with Torv's own, and a rumble rolled out of that vast chest that was not the warning growl and not quite the full welcome cry either. Something new, something the cradle pit had perhaps never had cause to make before, low and considering and very slightly approving. Cobble at Myra's feet made a soft chuffing sound of his own recognition, or encouragement, or simply 5 months of watching this particular warden retie his braid on quiet mornings, finally paying its own small dividend, and got up, ambled the length of the amphitheater floor with the unhurried confidence of a creature who had never once in his life needed to rush toward anything he trusted, and settled himself, with a great gusty sigh, directly against Torv's kneeling side. The amphitheater held its breath. Then Ithgar the cradle-bound lowered his great head the rest of the way and touched his tusk, gentle as a whisper from something that sighs could manage, to the crown of Torv's bowed head. The old gesture, older than the written law, that every Varn in that amphitheater had grown up hearing described in stories and had never, not one of them, expected to see performed in their own lifetime. "Warden," Kessa Oran said, and her voice, usually so carefully level, cracked audibly on the word. "The cradle has chosen. After 11 years, the Emberhold has a warden." The amphitheater did not erupt into cheering the way a human crowd might have. It did something the Varn had, Myra would learn, a much older and quieter tradition for 40,000 throats, and then the tens of thousands more crowded outside the amphitheater's walls listening by relay, all making, at once, the same low humming note the wardens along the pit wall had used for generations to answer the beast's own contented rumble. It rolled through the mountain stone bones like a second heartbeat, and Myra, sitting between Kessa Oran and a fully grown kindled the size of a small pony, felt it in her back teeth exactly the way she'd felt Ithgar's first welcome cry, 5 months and a lifetime ago, and understood, for the first time in a way that finally, fully landed, just how enormous a thing she had accidentally been part of fixing. Warden Torv's first formal act, once the ceremony's long procession of oaths and blessings had finally wound to its close, was to cross the amphitheater floor to where Myra sat and kneel. Not to her, he was careful to say, flushing slightly, but beside her, the way an equal kneels beside a friend rather than a subject before a ruler, and press into her hands a small braided cord of his own hair, dark and simple, tied off with the same knot pattern she'd taught the kindled 5 months earlier. The wardens have been arguing for weeks over what to call it officially, he said. Braid bond, cradle cord, something with more dignity, Elder Oran keeps suggesting. He grinned, the careful court solemnity of the last hour finally cracking into something younger and more real. I told them it already has a name, the quiet claiming. I figured it should stay that way. Some things shouldn't get fancier just because they turned out to matter more than anyone expected. A year turned before the last real test of everything the cradle pit had rebuilt came, and it came, as these things so often did, from a direction no one in either the Emberhold or Aldergate Landing had spent much time watching. The high ridgelines above Keswick's Reach had always held more than the cradle's single ancient beast. Bram Asa had spoken of it once, early in Myra's visits, almost in passing, that Ithgar was the eldest and greatest of his kind, but not the only one, that the deep wild crags beyond the Emberhold's settled valleys held territories no Varn expedition in 3 centuries had mapped in full, and that whatever lived out there had, by long unspoken agreement, been left alone precisely because no one wanted to learn firsthand what an untended apex predator twice Ithgar's age, and none of his patients might be capable of. It came down out of the high crags in the deep cold of that second winter, driven, the wardens would later piece together from the tracks, by a hard season and a territory dispute it had lost to something even larger and hungrier further north. A scaled, low-slung predator half again Ithgar's length though leaner, faster, with none of the ancient beast's centuries-deep familiarity with anything that walked on 2 legs, and it came down the ridge in the gray hour before dawn, straight toward the cluster of warm lights and food smells that was Aldergate Landing. Myra woke to Cobble's low, urgent chuffing outside her dome window. He had taken over the past year to sleeping curled against the outer wall on the nights she stayed home rather than at the pit, a habit none of the elders had officially sanctioned, and none of them had ever once tried to stop. And by the time she'd pulled on her boots and jacket, half the colony was already awake, Administrator Holt's emergency siren cutting through the pre-dawn dark. And her father was in the doorway with his face gone the color of old ash. Perimeter sensors caught something crossing the outer fence line 8 minutes ago, Callum said, already reaching for her, already half-turning to pull her back inside. Something big, Myra. Bigger than anything Holt's ever logged out here. We need to get to the shelter dome, now. He didn't finish the sentence, because Cobble had already put himself between the doorway and the dark beyond it, ears flat, every plate along his gray hide standing on end, and from somewhere further up the ridge, closer than the cradle pit should have allowed for, closer than anything should have been able to move that fast across broken mountain ground in the dark, came a sound Myra had heard exactly once before, in a sealed stone chamber a year and a lifetime ago. Ithgar's roar, rolling down off the high ridge like the mountain itself had decided again that it was done being patient. He had felt it too. Whatever bond ran between them, wherever its true edges lay, no elder council study across a year of careful observation had ever fully mapped it. Ithgar the cradle-bound had felt the threat crossing toward Aldergate Landing's fence line before a single human sensor had finished processing the alert, and he was already moving, Ash and the 3 other kindled close behind him. Cobble breaking away from the doorway to join them, the moment he understood his sire, was already answering the call he'd been the first to raise. What followed, the accounts would later agree. From Bren's warden patrol scrambled out from the Emberhold's nearest garrison, and from Administrator Holt's own security footage both, was not a battle so much as a demonstration. Brutal, fast, and mercifully brief. The rogue predator, driven and desperate as it was, had never in its long solitary life encountered anything remotely its match. Ithgar met it at the outer fence line before it had covered half the distance to the nearest dome, and the fight that followed lasted less than 90 seconds before the intruder broke off, badly wounded, and fled back up into the high crags with 4 furious, snarling kindled harrying its retreat every step of the way, until Ithgar's own low recall rumble finally called them back. No human colonist was hurt, not one dome wall was breached. Myra found Ithgar afterward exactly where she expected to, standing sentinel over the widest gap in the perimeter fence with a shallow claw mark scored along one foreleg, and did what she had done in the lower chamber 2 years earlier without a second thought. Pressed her palm flat against the wound, ignored his low rumbling protest that he did not require her fussing, and stayed there anyway until Bram Asa, arriving breathless from the Emberhold garrison an hour behind Bren's patrol, could confirm for himself that the injury was shallow and already closing. "You didn't have to run the whole Ridge Road," Myra told him, mildly reproachful, watching the old beastkeeper catch his breath against the mended fence post. "He's fine. He always wins." "He is not invincible, child, whatever the old scrolls like to claim," Bram said, still breathing hard, though something in his weathered face was more relieved than he'd have admitted aloud. "I have buried enough of his kind's kin over 90 years to know better than to assume otherwise simply because he has never yet lost. Every winning streak ends eventually. I would prefer, very much, that I am there to help when his does, and that you are not standing quite so close to it when it happens." "I was standing exactly as close as I needed to be," Myra said, entirely unbothered, and Bram, looking at her steady, calm, utterly unafraid, a war beast's blood-warm claw mark cooling under her own small hand, found, as he so often did by then, that he had no honest argument left to make against her. By the time the sun cleared the eastern ridge, Administrator Holt stood at the shattered outer fence line with Callum and Priya Voss, watching Ithgar the Cradlebound settle his great bulk directly across the widest gap in the perimeter, plainly and simply intending to remain there until the fence could be properly repaired, and found himself, not for the first time in 2 years, entirely without an appropriate bureaucratic response. "I'm putting in for an official designation," he said finally, a little weakly, to Priya, watching Cobble trot a slow, deliberate patrol along the fence's inner edge, while Ash and his litter mates settled in a watchful row atop the nearest low ridge outcrop. "Auxiliary Perimeter Defense, Emberhold Liaison Division, something. The Colonial Authority is going to want paperwork for this, Priya, and I genuinely do not know what box to check." "Check the one that says it's family," Priya said, watching her daughter cross the frost-white grass to press her forehead briefly, gently, against Ithgar's great lowered tusk in the pale morning light, the way she'd taken to doing whenever he'd been in danger and come through it. A small, private ritual neither of them had ever needed to explain to anyone. "I don't think there's a more accurate word for it in any language on either of our worlds." News of the fence line defense reached the Emberhold by midday, and reached Warden Torv, freshly a year into a wardenship no one, least of all Torv himself, had ever expected to see conferred honestly, before the sun had fully set. He came down to Aldergate Landing himself that evening, still faintly awkward in his formal warden's robes, the same simple braid cord he'd once pressed into Myra's hands now worn openly on his own wrist as a mark of office rather than hidden inside a sleeve, and stood at the mended fence line with Bram Asa at his shoulder, watching Ithgar doze in the last of the daylight with the fully grown Cobble curled protectively against his flank and a 9-year-old. 10 now. Myra had turned 10 that spring. A fact she reminded every adult of at every available opportunity, human girl asleep against them both, worn out from a day that had started with a rogue predator's attack and ended, as her days so often did lately, in exactly the kind of quiet the Emberhold's oldest law had never once managed to promise anyone, until she'd wandered into it looking for a lizard. "I've been thinking," Torv said quietly to Bram, "about what the old scrolls actually meant all those centuries, calling this beast untamable." He watched Cobble's great gray flank rise and fall, slow and steady, under the weight of a sleeping human child neither he nor his sire had ever once needed to be told to guard. "I don't think they were wrong exactly. I don't think he's tame now either. I watched what he did to that rogue this morning, and there was nothing tame in it at all. I think untamable was just the wrong word for what they were actually watching this whole time. He was never waiting to be tamed." He shook his head, slow, something like wonder finally settling into an expression that had spent the last year learning to carry a wardenship's weight without losing the young warden underneath it. He was waiting to be trusted. Nobody in 600 years thought to simply offer him that, instead of a spear and an oath and a performance of courage they didn't feel. She just walked up and did it, because she never once considered that trusting him might be a mistake. Bram Asa, watching the same quiet scene with the particular contentment of a very old man who had spent 90 years tending a bond he'd never expected to see fully bloom in his own remaining lifetime, allowed himself, for once, the small indulgence of a real answer instead of a careful one. "That," he said, "is the only theory about this whole strange, wonderful business that I have never once found a reason to argue with." Vesic Thane did not simply accept the new order the way most of the Emberhold's clan lords, chastened by Dreath Corin's public disgrace, eventually did. He was too proud, and too certain still, that he understood better than a 10-year-old human girl and a warden barely a year seasoned exactly what the Emberhold's ancient institutions were for. His challenge, when it finally came, arrived not as an open attack, but the way every dangerous thing in Emberhold politics arrived, dressed in the careful language of tradition and concern, at the worst possible moment, in front of the largest possible audience. The occasion was the treaty renewal's 2nd anniversary, a formal gathering at Aldergate Landing itself, human and Varn dignitaries together for the first time in the outpost's history, meant to celebrate 2 years of a peace no one had truly believed at the start would survive its first winter. Vesic Thane arrived with a smaller retinue than his first visit to the Cradle Pit, but a sharper argument, and he waited until the formal ceremonies had concluded, and the gathering had loosened into something more open before he raised it, loudly enough to carry, in front of Administrator Holt, Warden Torv, Kessa Oran, and half of Aldergate Landing's assembled families. "I do not raise this to diminish anyone's evident affection," he said, with the same careful pale-eyed precision Myra remembered from a year and a half earlier. "But I raise it because our law, whatever else changed in Dreath Corin's disgrace, was never formally amended on one point, and a law left unamended remains a law regardless of how inconvenient we currently find it. The girl holds the standing of Cradle Ward. That standing was granted by council ruling, not by the Cradlebound's law itself, which recognizes only trial candidates and wardens. If a future council mind, say, should the clan lords ever tire enough of Torv's youth to reconsider determine that ruling exceeded the elder council's proper authority, the girl's standing could be revoked with a simple majority vote. I say this not as a threat." His thin smile suggested otherwise to every person listening. "I say it as a caution. Perhaps it is time the Emberhold considered writing this new law properly, permanently, beyond any future council's convenience to unmake, so that no one, ever again, need wonder whether a bond this size rests on something as fragile as a single ruling that could, in theory, be reversed." Administrator Holt, standing near enough to catch every word, felt his stomach drop the particular way it always did when Emberhold politics threatened to unravel something his colony had come to depend on, and glanced instinctively toward Priya and Callum Voss, both of whom had gone very still beside him, watching their daughter with the specific tight attentiveness of parents who had learned, over 2 years, exactly how much could go wrong for a family whose child's whole life had become tangled up in an alien mountain kingdom's law. It was, Kessa Oren would say afterward, a genuinely clever piece of political theater, raising a real and uncomfortable legal gap under the cover of concern for the very bond it threatened, forcing the council either to formalize Myra's standing in a way that would require reopening 600 years of succession law all over again, or to leave the gap standing and let Vesic Thane's faction quietly work to widen it over the coming years until the ruling could, indeed, someday be reversed. Ithgar the Cradlebound, who had accompanied Torv to the anniversary at the warden's own insistence, a gesture of trust in the human colony that had cost the young warden no small amount of council debate to arrange, had been dozing in the warm afternoon sun through most of the ceremony's long speeches, Cobble sprawled beside him, Ash and the other kindled scattered in a loose, watchful ring around the gathering's edges. But he was not, as Vesic Thane and every other Varn in that crowd would shortly be reminded, ever truly asleep when Myra Voss was within his sight. He rose at the word asterisk revoked, slow at first, unhurried, and then all at once, the full towering scale of him unfolding into the golden afternoon light with a suddenness that had half the gathered crowd stumbling back and Vesic Thane's own retinue reaching, instinctively, for weapons they knew perfectly well would do nothing at all against him. Ithgar did not roar. He did not threaten, not the way he had threatened Vesic once before, a lifetime ago, in the cradle pit's dust. He simply crossed the open ground to where Myra stood, lowered his great head until the furnace-orange eye was level with hers, and waited patient, certain, utterly unbothered by the stunned silence spreading through the crowd around them, while she reached up, without a flicker of hesitation, and rested her small hand flat against the plate beneath his jaw the way she had every single day for a year and a half. Then he turned that same ancient, unblinking gaze on Vesic Thane, and held it there, and said nothing at all, because he had already, 600 years ago and again 18 months ago and now a third time in front of an entire human colony, said everything on the subject he had ever intended to say. It was Warden Torv, into the ringing silence that followed, who finally gave the moment its proper legal weight. Lord Thane raises a fair technical point about the council ruling, Torv said, stepping forward, and there was nothing young or uncertain in his voice at all now, a full year of wardenship settled comfortably onto his shoulders. So let us settle it properly here, in front of every witness this gathering provides, so that no future council, yours or any other, ever has cause to reopen it. I am warden of the Emberhold, confirmed by the Cradlebound's own free choice, exactly as the oldest law requires. I hereby exercise the warden's ancient right of direct decree, unreviewable by council majority, to formally and permanently confirm the standing of Cradleward as belonging, for as long as she lives, to Myra Voss, a right no council vote, present or future, may touch. He turned deliberate to meet Vesic Thane's pale gold stare with a steadiness that had clearly cost the clan lord's careful theater every bit of its intended effect. I thank you for the caution, Lord Thane. It is fixed now. Permanently. You need never raise it again. Vesic Thane held his composure for exactly as long as it took to offer a stiff, correct bow and withdraw with what remained of his dignity. But the whispers that followed him back through the Emberhold's mountain halls in the days after carried a very different flavor than the ones that had once served his ambitions so well, because a clan lord who had tried, twice now, in front of increasingly large audiences, to threaten a beloved child standing and been publicly decisively overruled both times was not a man whose careful reputation for shrewd political instinct survived the accounting intact. He won't try a third time, Bram Asa said to Myra that evening, watching Vesic Thane's retinue depart down the ridge road in the fading light, Cobble once again curled contentedly at her feet. Not because he's changed his mind about you, child. Men like that rarely do. But because he's finally understood what the rest of the Emberhold worked out 18 months ago in that lower chamber, watching Ithker hold a hunger beast pinned rather than let it near you. The old beast keeper's clouded eyes crinkled with something warm and tired and entirely satisfied. There is no political argument, however clever, that outweighs 600 years of a beast's silence finally choosing to speak. Vesic Thane can write 100 careful arguments about council authority and revocable rulings. He cannot write one that survives Ithker simply standing up. Myra saw Dreeth Corin exactly once more, nearly 2 years after the judgment. On a supply visit to the Eastern Mining Gallery, she had gone along on with her mother, who still, from time to time, consulted with the tunnel engineers on ventilation biology. Neither of her parents' original job descriptions had ever quite anticipated needing. He was thinner than she remembered, his hands rough now in the particular way of a man who did real labor rather than simply signing orders for others to do it. And when he saw her across the gallery floor, he did not approach, did not try to explain himself or ask forgiveness. He plainly no longer believed he was owed. He simply stopped where he stood, inclined his head to her with a formality that had nothing performed left in it at all, and went back to his work. "Do you hate him?" Priya asked quietly, once they were clear of the gallery, watching her daughter's thoughtful, unhurried silence with the particular attention of a parent gauging exactly how much weight a hard question was actually carrying. Myra considered it for a long moment, the way she considered most things that mattered. "I don't think so," she said finally. "I think he was scared of losing something, and he did a lot of really bad things because he was scared, and none of that makes the bad things okay. But Bram says being sorry doesn't undo anything either. It just means you're finally telling the truth about what you did." She was quiet another moment. "I think I mostly just feel sad that it took him 11 years and getting caught to figure out that being honest would have worked better than all that scheming. He could have just asked Ithker, the way Torv did. He never even tried." Priya didn't have an answer for that, better than the one her daughter had already found on her own, and did not try to offer one. She only put an arm around Myra's shoulders and let the two of them walk the rest of the way back to the transport, in a silence that needed nothing added to it. Pebble, for the record, was never found. Myra had long since given up any real hope of it. 6 weeks after the fence line vanishing that started everything, Bram Asa had gently suggested that a small blue skink loose in the high crags above the cradle pit had almost certainly become, in the honest, unsentimental way of the wild, a meal for something considerably less inclined toward bonded recognition than Ithker had proven to be. Myra had cried about it exactly once, quietly, curled against Cobble's flank on a gray autumn afternoon, and then had done what she did with most losses too large to carry for long, folded the grief down small, tucked it somewhere safe, and kept moving forward toward whatever came next. What came next, over the 2 years that followed the anniversary gathering and Vesic Thane's second, final humiliation, was mostly quiet, the particular hard-won, unglamorous quiet of a peace that had been fought for honestly, and was, for that reason, built to actually last. The Emberhold settled under Warden Torv's steady, still young but no longer uncertain hand into a stability the Mountain Kingdom had not known in over a decade. The trial resumed its old proper rhythm, one honest candidate a season most recognized, a few gently, sorrowfully turned away by a beast whose judgment no council manipulation could shade anymore, and every single outcome accepted, without exception, as final and fair. Aldergate Landing grew, new domes, new families, a proper trade agreement with the Emberhold's mountain markets that had Administrator Holt filing paperwork, with something closer to genuine cheerfulness than the colonial authority had ever heard from him before. And Myra Voss grew too, the way children do when no one is watching closely enough to notice it happening. An inch here, a season there, until the small girl who had crawled under a restricted fence chasing a lizard was, at 12, tall enough to no longer need help climbing Ithgar's foreleg, and confident enough in the climb that Bram Asa had, after a long internal debate with himself that he confessed to no one but Kessa Oran, quietly stopped hovering quite so close during her visits. The kindled grew too, faster and further than any brood in the Emberhold's recorded history, because Bram's old theory, tested now across 3 full years of patient observation, had turned out to be exactly right. A brood raised by a sire who trusted and taught, and was in turn taught new small gentle things by a girl who had never once considered that trust might be a mistake, grew into something the Cradle Pit's oldest histories had no real precedent for at all. Not simply 5 powerful young predators, but 5 creatures who had learned from their very first weeks of life that strength and gentleness were not opposites requiring a choice between them, but 2 hands of the same animal, to be used exactly as the moment required. Kabul, at 3 years old, stood taller at the shoulder than any warden in the Emberhold's guard, his head-butting habit long since refined into something closer to a formal greeting. He performed with careful, deliberate control on anyone he liked, and never once on anyone who hadn't earned it. He had by then taken over Ussa Bren's old habit of shadowing Myra's walk from the pit gate to the western stair on every visit, a duty no one had assigned him, and no one would have dreamed of taking away, and the younger wardens had taken to joking, with real affection under the humor, that the Emberhold now employed 2 guard captains, one who wore armor and drew a wage, and one who wore a grass braid and would, without hesitation, dismantle a mountain to keep his girl safe. Ash, once the smallest and most fragile of the litter, had grown into something quieter and more watchful than his siblings. Bram called him the thoughtful one, the kindled most likely to be found simply sitting near Myra while she did homework at the pit's edge, present without needing anything from the moment beyond her company. The other 3 had scattered, in the way grown kindled eventually did, into their own territories along the high ridgelines, though all 3 still came down, without fail, every season, to check on the sister brood mates, and the girl who had braided their first crooked grass rings with more patience than anyone had ever shown them before. Ithgar himself did not change, not visibly, not in any way 3 years could measure against 600. The cradle-bound aged the way mountains aged, on a scale no single human or Varn lifetime could fully witness. But something in the low, constant rumble that had settled into him from the very first afternoon a fence rail gave way had never once, across 3 years, gone quiet. Kessa Oran, watching him doze in the Cradle Pit's afternoon sun, with a 12-year-old human girl doing schoolwork against his warm flank, 5 kindled arranged in various states of watchful repose around them, once tried to describe the sight to a visiting colonial authority archivist who had come, at last, to formally document what half the sector's HFY-adjacent bureaucratic circles had taken, by then, to calling simply the Kessiks reach accord. "I have spent 64 years now in service to this cradle," the old elder told the archivist, standing at the pit's rear rail while the recorder's small drone hovered discreetly overhead. "I have watched 3 wardens rise and 2 of them die. I have watched a regency of quiet, careful corruption wrought the trial from the inside for 11 years before anyone had the evidence to stop it. I have written more legal arguments about the nature of a beast's judgment than any elder in 6 centuries of the Emberhold's history." She looked out at the pit floor, at the small ordinary scene of a girl and a monster, and a pile of drowsing kindled that had, somehow, without a single grand gesture, remained the oldest institution her people had ever built. "And in all of it, the truest thing I have ever recorded, the thing I would ask you to write into whatever archive your authority keeps, above every legal ruling and every treaty clause, is this: he was never untamable. He was simply waiting for someone honest enough to stop trying to tame him at all." The archivist, a careful, precise woman who had catalogued 41 similarly extraordinary first contact and bonded companion cases across the sector in her long career, looked at the small girl doing what appeared to be long division against the flank of a creature large enough to level a building, and admitted, in the report she eventually filed, that this was the first time in 11 years of field work she had genuinely struggled to find sufficiently dry professional language for what she had witnessed. They held the 3rd anniversary of the fence line breach, the day the Emberhold's oldest histories had by then quietly begun calling the first claiming, though no elder had ever formally decreed it a holiday. At the cradle pit itself, the way they always did, with the trial elders in their red robes along the platform, Warden Torv presiding with the easy authority of a man 4 years into a seat that had finally stopped feeling borrowed. And half of Aldergate Landing's families crowded along the outer fence line beside the assembled Varn, because by the 3rd year the line between who belonged inside the pit and who belonged outside, it had blurred past any colonial authority's ability to properly file it. Myra stood at the pit center in the same spot near enough, where a fence rail had given way 3 years earlier, 12 years old now, tall and steady and utterly unbothered by the crowd's attention in a way that had never once needed to be taught to her. Cobble stood at her shoulder, full-grown, magnificent, his gray plating catching the afternoon light the way Ithgar's own dark hide had once caught it on that first terrified, wondering day. Ash sat at her other side, quiet and watchful as ever, the braid ring around his straight quills so old and careful kept by now that Torv had taken, half joking, to calling it a family heirloom. And Ithgar the cradle-bound, ancient beyond any single lifetime's easy measuring, lowered his great head one more time, the same slow, deliberate bow he had offered a bewildered 9-year-old on the very first afternoon of all of this, the gesture that had shattered 600 years of settled law and rebuilt something truer in its place, until his shoulder rested low enough, close enough, for Myra to climb. She did it the same way she had the first time, without ceremony, without a rehearsed word, one hand finding the familiar warm groove between his shoulder plates, one foot finding its old certain purchase along his foreleg, and pulled herself up into the high, warm hollow behind his neck where she had, across 3 years, spent more quiet afternoons than she could count doing homework, watching storms roll across the ridge. Once falling genuinely asleep for 2 full hours while Bram Asa stood guard below and refused, with great and visible satisfaction, to wake her. From up there, high above the pit floor, high above the crowd of Varn and human faces both turned up to watch her, Myra could see clear across the ridge to where Aldergate Landing's lights were just beginning to flicker on in the deepening blue evening. The same view she'd first glimpsed from this exact height in her very first week of visits, when the whole strange, enormous thing that had happened to her was still too large and new to properly understand. She understood it now. Not all of it, not the 600 years of law, not the careful architecture of Dreeth Corin's 11-year corruption, not even the full shape of whatever ancient, patient thing had lived inside Ithgar for 6 centuries, waiting without ever quite knowing it was waiting. But she understood the part that had always, from that very first bewildered afternoon, actually mattered. That she had climbed a fence looking for a lost lizard, and found instead something that had never once in 3 years given her a single reason to be afraid of it, and that this, the warm weight of a beast's trust, freely given and never once withdrawn, the small fierce family of kindled who would tear the world apart before they let anything harm her, and who spent their quiet afternoons instead learning to braid grass, and share their food and sleep curled against her side. This had turned out to be worth considerably more than any seat or title or law the Emberhold's oldest scrolls had ever tried to build around it. Below, at the fence line, Callum Voss stood with one arm around Priya's shoulders, watching their daughter sit calm and small and entirely unafraid against the shoulder of the largest, most dangerous, most gentle creature either of them had ever laid eyes on, and felt, for the 1000th time in 3 years, the particular vertigo of loving someone brave enough to make you proud and terrified in the exact same breath. You know, Priya said quietly, not taking her eyes off the pit. When Holt asked me, that very first night, whether she was all right, I told him she was better than fine. She'd made friends with a war god's puppies. A small, wondering laugh escaped her. 3 years and a lifetime removed from the shaking, disbelieving woman who'd said those words the first time. I don't think I understood that night just how completely right I actually was. No, Callum agreed, watching Ithgar's low, contented rumble roll out across the pit one more time, watching Cobble press his great gray head against Myra's dangling foot in wordless affection, watching Ash settle, patient as ever, into the shadow of his sire's foreleg to wait for her to come back down. Neither did I. Warden Torv, standing at the platform rail beside Kessa Oran and old Bram Asa, watched the same scene with the quiet satisfaction of a man who had, 4 years earlier, knelt at a chain he'd been half certain would kill him, afraid and honest in equal measure, and been chosen for exactly that honesty rather than despite it. 600 years, he said, half to himself, half to the old beast keeper beside him, of candidates believing the trial was about proving they weren't afraid. It was never that at all, was it? No, Bram Asa said, watching a 12-year-old girl laugh at something only she and a mountain-sized beast seemed to share. 3 years of grass braids and storm shelter, and one terrible morning in a sealed stone chamber folded into the easy, unremarkable comfort of the moment. It was only ever about whether you were honest enough to let something enormous and dangerous see exactly how small and unguarded you really were, and trust that it would choose to be gentle with you anyway. The old man's clouded eyes crinkled, warm and satisfied and very, very tired in the particular good way of a life's long work finally, fully arrived. She never had to learn that lesson, Warden. She simply already knew it, the whole time, and the rest of us spent 600 years building an entire mountain kingdom's law around trying to teach candidates something a 9-year-old already understood the very first afternoon she went looking for her lizard. High above them, in the last warm light of the anniversary evening, Ithgar the cradle-bound, the beast every scroll in 6 centuries of Emberhold history had called untamable, unteachable, unreachable by anything smaller than a spear and an oath, turned his great furnace-orange eyes toward the ridge, toward the small scattered lights of a human colony that had become, without either people quite planning it, an extension of the same wide, patient territory he had guarded alone for 600 years. And made once more. The low, contented rumble that the warden still had no better name for than the one Myra had given it herself, on that very first bewildered afternoon, without knowing yet that it would come to mean everything. Welcome home. Myra Voss, 12 years old, sat high on the shoulder of the most dangerous creature on the whole of Keswick's reach, felt his next slow breath move beneath her like a held tide finally, fully let go, and was, in that one warm, ordinary moment, exactly as unafraid as she had been on the very first day, not because she had grown brave enough to earn it, but because she had never once needed to. She had simply climbed, 3 years ago, onto the back of something the whole world had called untamable, and found, waiting there the whole time, something that had only ever wanted in 600 patient years, for someone small enough and honest enough to finally climb on and stay.